Good evening. I hope you had a good week. We made it. It's Friday. Thank God. You're alive and you're well. Thank God. Now, let's relax. We'll see how much we will relax because we're gonna deal with tough topics. Life-changing topics. At least that was the case for me. So, without further ado, a discussion between one of the two highest renowned scientist and philosopher of science. The latter is Dr. Stephen Meyer and James Tour, a biochemist, I believe. They're going to discuss the origin of life on Earth. This will be fun. Let's see where all this will lead. Did I mention that we're gonna play Bannerlord? Yes, my lord. Let's go. We conquered Salona. Currently I'm a vassal. Currently I'm a vassal to the Byzantines. Also, in war with the Western Roman Empire. We're getting ground. But also, I have a wife, sister to the Byzantine Emperor, pretty high up there. So, let's see where this leads.
Science and Faith podcast with Dr. James Tour, and I'm your host, James Tour. And you can visit me and see my professional credentials at jmtour.com or my social media at drjamestour.com.
Let's go.
And this particular podcast is being done in collaboration with Crosspoint Church and West University Baptist Church. And for future podcasts, you can go to signup.drjamestour.com to be part of the questioning audience in the future. So I'm a real practicing scientist. That's what I do for a living. That's what I get paid to do. And I love Jesus more than anything else in the world. So if you put those two together, I'm sure that this is an unusual podcast. And my purpose for this podcast is unabashedly to see Jesus Christ glorified by seeing people get saved.
Good man.
And secondly, to have Christians built up in their faith.
Amen.
Now, with that, I want to introduce my speaker for today, Dr. Stephen Meyer, who's director of the Discovery Institute's Center for Science and Culture in Seattle. He's a trained scientist with undergraduate work in physics, a master's in philosophy of science from Cambridge, as well as a PhD from Cambridge. His doctoral thesis was of Clues and Causes, a methodological interpretation of origin of life research. And he's been, Dr. Meyer has been at the Discovery Institute since 1996. And before that, he was both a professor and a geophysicist working here in the state of Texas. He's well known through TV appearances, podcasts, and debates through the Discovery Institute. He's written a number of different books, Explore Evolution from 2007, 2009, Signature of the Cell, which I have here, big whopping 600-page book, very famous book, Signature of the Cell. And then also from 2013, Darwin's Doubt, 2013. And let me get a good look there. Darwin's Doubt, 2013. And I think he has another newer book coming out. But so Dr. Stephen Meyer, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you for having me, Jim, and I'm sorry about all the technical difficulties we've had so far.
We appreciate your taking time to join us. The first question I want to ask you is this: why do you, as such an educated person, believe in the physical resurrection of Jesus Christ, and what does that mean in your life?
It's one of those few things that, if true, changes everything, right? The human condition is undeniably limited. We live on a planet that spins in free space around a sun, and we get so many trips around, and then no one gets off the planet alive. And for me, I started reading the Gospels as a teenager after having had an experience of, I guess now I understand it to have been a kind of metaphysical angst. It was a kind of anxiety that I was experiencing about whether life had any ultimate meaning. And it made me wonder if there was something wrong with me, because I had questions popping into my head that I couldn't answer. And I, at some point, decided to crack the family Bible that was on the coffee table upstairs. I started with the Gospel of Matthew, and when I got to the end, I realized that it was if true, the gospel narrative changed everything. And at some point, I began to investigate the reliability of the biblical texts, and I found that there was tremendous historical support for the reliability. I remember first encountering the work of Josephus and finding that the basic story of the gospel was repeated in secular historical sources. And then I later examined the evidence for the resurrection itself, and there are three key facts. There's in fact a very powerful argument called the minimal facts argument that's been developed by scholars such as William Lane Craig and Gary Habermas. And as you look at those three key facts, the empty tomb, the appearances of Jesus, and this explosive origin of Christianity in the Mediterranean world, it's very difficult to explain all three of these without without positing an actual bodily resurrection. In fact, I think it's the best explanation of those facts and many others. For me, the testimony of James is incredibly important, because James was the half-brother of Jesus. We know from the Gospels that he originally rejected the claims of Jesus to be the Messiah and the Son of God, and something changed his mind very dramatically, such that he was later the leader of the Jewish Jerusalem church. And we know from secular sources, in particular from Josephus, that he was martyred for his faith in about 61 AD. So that's you start looking at that type of historical evidence, you have to ask, well, what changed James' mind? What changed Paul's mind? Why were these early disciples willingly accepting martyrdom, not for an abstract philosophy, but for something they said they saw and were in a position to know was false if on the basis of their own eyewitness testimony. So as I began to look at those historical sources, I found them very compelling, that the gospel story was not only a story that gave us hope, but one that was grounded in historical fact. And it takes a while to kind of sift through all that evidence, but it's pretty powerful, and it's convinced me. And obviously the encounter with Christ, I mean, I shouldn't say obviously, but for me, the person of Christ encountered in the pages of Scripture is just a very compelling person. He brings together two things that we humans very rarely bring together. In fact, this happens over and over, but we have right now tender-hearted in our political discourse, compassionate liberals and hard-headed conservatives, and Jesus seemed to bring together grace and truth. He brought them together in one person, and we tend to bifurcate. We accept one side or the other of a whole bunch of dichotomies. And so I found his person very unique. And then when I examined the claims of the narratives historically, I became convinced that what the Gospels are recording had actually happened. And so the human condition, I think, looks very different if you realize that there is life, there is every prospect of life eternal if you accept the gift that Christ is offering.
It's a gift.
Well, that's great.
That's good news.
That's great. I've never heard it put that way, that none of us are going to get off the planet alive. That's an interesting way of putting it. I guess it takes a philosopher to.
I'm a
sum
bit of
it
an
in that
amateur.
way.
I'm a bit of an amateur astronomer, Jim, and I've been up late last week looking at the comet, and last 2 nights, beautiful views of Saturn and Jupiter and the moons, and as you begin to just looking at the sky in that way, and the night sky in particular, and you realize the vastness of the universe, where now the astronomers now tell us there's at least 200 billion galaxies the size of the Milky Way. And then we have our own, solar system, and it is a beautiful system. Newton said that this most beautiful system of sun, planets, and comets could only proceed from the counsel and dominion of an intelligent and powerful being. It's a wonderful quote from the General Scholium. So there's a sense of order and beauty, but also apart from the belief in a divine creator, the vastness of the universe is kind of terrifying, because you realize we're just on a one little blue dot, so anomalous, so unusual among all the planetary bodies. We have liquid water here. We're just the right axial tilt we're just the right distance from a sun of just the right size to sustain life. It suggests design, but if you don't accept that, then we're just here for a little tiny speck of time on a little tiny speck. And what is man that the psalmist says, "What is man that thou art mindful of him?" But what if there's no one there, and we're all that's the only conscious life on the planet? After we die, we rot, and that's it. So, to me, there's always been this kind of existential dichotomy. If God is real, then meaning is possible. If he's not, then we can enjoy life as best we can for the short time we're here, but there's no possibility of ultimate meaning. Nothing can mean anything to a planet or a rock or a star.
Right.
Things only mean things to persons. So unless there's an ultimate person who exists after we pass on, there is no prospect of ultimate meaning to human existence. And I think that's why the resurrection and why God coming in the flesh and revealing himself as the reality behind the universe really does change everything.
Beautiful. Thank you, Steve. Now you just took this in a direction that I was hoping it was going to go. You talked a little bit about the fine-tuning of the universe. Now I want you to narrow that down and talk about the fine-tuning that it would take to have life, or that it takes to have life. Talk about constants that you might know of, or the fine-tuning around life itself.
I've got a new book coming out, as you know, about extending the argument for intelligent design in an overtly theistic direction. I think
this is 2020.
I've written, as if you, on the origin of life problem. And there's such exquisite evidence of design in the inner workings of the cell. But if you, at least theoretically, some have proposed, even Francis Crick proposed, that the cell was designed and transported here to Earth. He was so taken with the severity of the origin of life problem, he suggested that maybe life had arisen someplace else in the cosmos and then it had been seeded here. It was a theory called directed panspermia. But
cop out. But that's a cop out.
That's a strange theory. It doesn't really answer the ultimate question of the origin of biological information, for one, because to get life you have to have that code that makes all forms of life possible. And so in a sense, Crick and others who proposed this kind of kicked the problem out into deep space without answering the ultimate problem, which is where do you get the information, the code that makes life possible. But in addition to that, there's an even more fundamental level of design in the very fabric of the universe, the laws and the constants of physics, the initial conditions of the universe, and some of the contingent features of the universe, like the speed of light or the expansion rate of the universe or the cosmological constant. So I've been writing about these because this is a kind of design that can't possibly be explained by any being within the cosmos, because it's built into the very fabric of the universe from the very beginning. From the Big Bang forward, we've had this exquisite fine-tuning. So one of the first discoveries of this fine-tuning was made by Fred Hoyle, who was, at that point in his career, a very aggressive, or let's say overt atheist. He had proposed the steady-state theory of the origin of the universe as an alternative to the Big Bang, because he saw that the Big Bang had obvious theistic implications. If the universe has a beginning, if the material and physical universe has a beginning, then you can't posit some material cause beyond the universe to bring it into existence, because matter and energy are what are coming into existence. So Hoyle was troubled by that and came up with this steady state idea. It ultimately didn't really pass the test of experience. Many observations were made that refuted it. But in the 50s, he had an abrupt change of metaphysical position, of worldview, when he discovered the fine-tuning that was necessary, the multiple fine-tuning parameters that were necessary to make carbon possible and oxygen possible. And he was a stellar astrophysicist and realized that to get it was called the resonance levels of carbon, the precise energy levels at which carbon would form from lighter elements, that a whole host of other fine-tuning parameters had to be just right. In particular, the heat inside stars during fusion, and that required very finely tuned amount of gravitation. A little too much one way, a little too little the other, and carbon would not be possible. Without carbon, you couldn't get complex chemistry. Without complex chemistry, you couldn't get life. And so I think there's about 36 of these fundamental fine-tuning parameters that have to be exactly right, and within very narrow tolerances. So the physicists now sometimes talk about us living in a kind of Goldilocks universe where gravitational force constant is not too strong, not too weak. The electromagnetic force constant, not too strong, not too weak. The ratio between the two constants, very precise to make complex chemistry possible, and on it goes. And then the other form of fine-tuning is the fine-tuning that's required at the very beginning of the universe in the configuration of mass energy. We live in a universe now where you look out in the night sky, you have the right kind of telescope, you can see these beautifully ordered galaxies. But for there to be the amount of order we have in the universe now, there had to be an even greater amount of order, of low entropy at the very beginning of the universe. And the physicist Roger Penrose has calculated that degree of entropy fine-tuning, of initial entropy fine-tuning, and he's come up with an incredibly tiny exponential ratio, 1 in 10, a hyper-exponential, 1 in 10 to the 10 to the 123. You can't even get your mind around a number like that. So at every level, the universe, in the setup job at the beginning, in the fine-tuning of the constants, the strength of the fundamental forces, and then finally in the structure of our solar system as well.
Of course.
As I mentioned, we're
Jupiter,
just the right distance from just the right kind of
planet.
sun, with just the right axial tilt, with a Jupiter, big gas giant, sweeping the outer parts of the solar system,
That's right.
protecting us from asteroids.
Go.
It's just exquisite, all the factors that are just right to allow for first complex chemistry, and then a life-friendly planet like Earth. So if you start thinking about all that, you take it a little less for granted.
That's so true. You know, when you speak like this, it brings tears to my eyes because when you study
Good man.
the science and you think about how marvelous it is, you look at this and you say, this is just amazing, the way these pieces have come together. So for example, in a cell, all of these different interactions are going, and all of these different pieces. I want to do a thought experiment so maybe the audience can realize, you know, Steve and I sometimes we'll call each other for some short little thing, and we'll end up spending over an hour on the phone speaking together about whatever topic is latest to speak about in science.
Like C.S. Lewis.
So Steve, think
Like C.S. Lewis and Tolkien, right? Something like that. They used to talk late nights and had discussions of philosophizing about faith.
Think about this thought experiment. People always want to take the basic chemicals and make them. So you've got to have the nucleic acids, the amino acids, the lipids, and the saccharides. They always try to make these. They're abysmal at trying to make these under any prebiotic conditions. And generally when they're made, they're racemic, they're not optically pure. And if there is some chirality, the optical purity is very low. But then stringing them together is another problem. But say you had all these pieces, and how do you assemble them into a cell? We have no idea how to assemble them into a cell, how to take how to take this DNA and wrap it around a histone to just get the enzymes just going just right to do that. We're clueless on these sorts of things. But let's, in this thought experiment, say we already have a functioning, working cell. So everything is in place. But now the cell just dies. Just died a nanosecond ago. It just died. What did we just lose? And what would we have to do to get it going again? Because everything is approximately in place. Have we any idea how to get this cell going again?
Well, it's the Humpty Dumpty problem, right? You've got all of these pieces, but all those pieces does not a living organism make. And there's a more technical name for this problem in origin of life studies, as you know, the Leventhal paradox. You know, you've got even if you start with all the proteins, it turns out, the number of different ways of arranging all those proteins that have nothing to do with life vastly outstrips. Is a huge exponential number. It's 10 to the 66 million or something. I have to look it up. I was just writing about it, but it's a huge exponential
10 to the 79, exactly. 10 to the 79 billion. 10 to the 79 billion in a single cell.
Right. Yeah. 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 The 10 to the 66 million is the number of different models, inflationary cosmological models that do not result in a life-friendly universe. So that's another one of these, you know, fine-tuning parameters. I got the two huge exponential numbers mixed up, but yeah, that Leventhal thing. So you've got all these different pieces. You have all the right pieces. Origin of life scientists are straining to get amino acids under realistic prebiotic conditions, and have you shown so beautifully they can't do it without all kinds of investigator interference. They have to use very precise recipes and introduce the right reagents at the right time and remove the byproducts that they don't want so they don't get interfering cross reactions. And all they're getting in the end of the day is amino acids, which are just components of proteins that have to be arranged in very precise order. Well, the Leventhal paradox is, well, I'll give you all the proteins. And even with all the proteins, there's so many different possible ways of arranging them that don't result in an integrated living cell, that you're faced with these enormous search problems that are vastly beyond what we call the probabilistic resources of the universe. So the undirected chance plus necessity approach to the origin of life, I think, seems
impossibility.
Really hopeless. I think it's a non-starter. Intellectually, if you're really honest about what it takes to build a living organism, even the very simplest living organism.
Yes, I agree. Now, since you're a philosopher as well, so tell me, when we've just lost this functioning of the cell has just stopped working, so it's no longer alive. What is life? What is it we just lost?
Beautiful
Tell it
minds.
to me. What is it? What have we just lost?
What do they say in legal matters? That's a deep and imponderable question. I mean, I don't think people have tried in vain to define life, and we can define the necessary conditions of life, but we've all, I think, had the sense that there's something about life that's greater than the sum of its parts. And you don't have to be a cell biologist to know this. If you've ever lost a person that you love and you're with them at that moment of death, all the parts are still there, but the person is no longer there. What is that that's left? You know, in the biblical view, it's a spirit, a soul, a mind, and a spirit. It's something immaterial. And now, I don't know when we're talking about a living cell as opposed to a human being. Of the human being, I'm sure there's a spirit and a mind, you know, but there's something mysterious about life that we haven't really come to grips with. We know what's necessary from the standpoint of the physical substrates, what has to be in place to make life possible. But when life leaves, we don't exactly know what it is that's left, but we know something is left, and it's not just the physical.
Yeah, you know, if I could just try to reduce this to something utterly amazing that maybe our audience, those watching, would want to think about. We are so clueless on this thing. If a cell just dies, it's hard for us to define what it is we just lost. Just try to describe what life What is it? Is it just this potential across a bilayer? No, it's many, many, many things together, and we're not sure even how to define that thing, let alone make it from the bottom up. We are utterly clueless. And what happens is people think that scientists have already figured this thing out. And so they just kind of accept it. Well, scientists know how to do that. They don't. They're clueless. Share something on this, Steve.
And even more so when it comes to the origin of life. It's hard enough to define what it is, but as you've shown, trying to explain how it got here from a prebiotic soup or whatever the theories. I mean, you and I both have a deep interest in this question. I did my PhD on it, and my first book, as you kindly shared with your audience, was about that. And you've been writing these fantastic articles for Inference and other places, holding these guys to account, because our students are told that we do have this all figured out, that chemistry in a warm little pond or in a prebiotic soup would have, with the right spark or lightning or something, would have reacted and naturally and gotten more and more and more complex. And we found that you actually in the laboratory you can't move you can't move the chemicals in a life-friendly direction without repeated interventions of intelligent investigators. And to my way of thinking, these simulation experiments in origin of life research or origin of life studies, they have a particular logic about them. They're based on uniformitarian reasoning. The present is the key to the past. What we see happening in the laboratory is our guide to understanding what is plausible to think might have happened in the past. So when these investigators, time and time again, can't form even proteinaceous amino acids without, in a sense, cooking the book, setting up the experiment in just the right way, introducing just the right reagents at just the right time, removing the stuff so they don't get the interfering cross reactions, et cetera, what are they actually simulating? It seems to me they're simulating the need for a mind to move the chemicals in a life-friendly direction. And at the same time, we still don't have a definition of what life is. We know it when we see it. We know when it's gone, but we know it's necessary. We know we need energy. We need to hold a complex system far from thermodynamic equilibrium. We need information. We need metabolic pathways. We need various things to make life, but those are necessary conditions that all have to be in a precise configuration with each other in order for there to be life as a whole. And yet we don't really have a complete definition, but the origin of life is utterly mystifying from a materialistic point of view, and every attempt to simulate it seems to suggest the need for a designing intelligence to superintend over the process.
Yeah, it's interesting to sit with you because you and I have attended meetings together for the last several years, and we hear different people come up with their different little proposals. And as soon as you ask for details, it goes into storytelling. And it's just how utterly clueless we are. Let me begin to turn this in another direction, because you had mentioned something about this non-equilibrium. One of your colleagues, Brian Miller, Dr. Brian Miller, so he writes about this not from the perspective that I do. I look at this from a synthetic organic chemist. He's writing about this as a physical chemist, and he writes this, and I want you to unpack this. So listen to this carefully, what he writes. Many people say that the simplest of life is a bacterium. So he says bacteria of all levels of complexity must generate in their cell membranes, at least 100,000 ATP molecules per second per micron squared to simply maintain their integrity against the constant thermodynamic forces disrupting their homeostatic stability. A drop in power results in the metabolism halting and the cell irreversibly decomposing into an amorphous conglomeration of simpler chemicals. So explain to us what this means, that life is a non-equilibrium system, and how nature tries to move things toward an equilibrium, and what all this means.
Right. Let me put this discussion in a little broader context. There's been a kind of a back and forth. The old line creationists used to say that the life couldn't have evolved because it violates the second law of thermodynamics. Because living systems are highly ordered. Things tend to go from disorder to order, from low to high entropy. High entropy being more disorder, low entropy being more order. The standard evolutionary response was, well, that's true as far as it goes, but it's overly simplistic. If you push energy through a system, you can maintain a higher level of order because of the energy moving through the system in a localized environment. You can have, overall, you'll still have more disorder, but in a localized environment, you can maintain a high degree of order, providing you're pushing energy through a system. And since our sun is pumping energy into Earth all the time, we can have high order in our localized environment, even though in the solar system as a whole, we're moving towards disorder. And that's true as far as it goes. We have lots of examples of that. A tornado will create, the energy that produces the tornado creates a localized increase in order with the swirling vortex. But the problem is with these non-equilibrium systems that the kind of order that's produced has nothing to do with the kind of order we see in biology. It's a highly symmetric order, like a swirling vortex, or think of also you could unplug your bathtub and see that make a vortex. Gravitational energy will produce that order. The kind of order we have in life is not repetitive order or symmetric order. It's actually information, or it's complex order. And so these non-equilibrium thermodynamics explanations do a good job of explaining what doesn't need to be explained in life. If you think of the genetic code or any sequence of digital characters, if you get a repeat, ABC, 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 or in the genes, if you got AG, 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 that would be a highly repetitive order, but it's not informational. It doesn't have the capacity to produce a complex three-dimensional protein fold. That type of what's required there is much more like language. I use an example in my book of a series of randomly arranged characters, a series of repetitive characters, and then a sequence like time and tide wait for no man. That third type of sequence we say is specified and complex. It's the kind of order we have in information. Its arrangements are not rigidly repeating, and yet it's specified in order to perform a function. And so that's what the kind of thing that's got to be explained in biology, not just something like a vortex or a swirling tornado. Now, recently, there's been a scientist, Jeremy England, who was at MIT, now he's at Georgia Tech, who's written on something they're called dissipation theorems. And these purport to show that you can have, life is special in two ways. It's special because it's a low entropy system, and it also has a lot of energy. It's high thermal energy. And to get those two things, it's highly ordered, but in a specific informational way, and it's storing energy. And so that makes life very difficult to explain. It's unusual. If we look out, we see lots of things that have energy in them, but they're not highly ordered, especially not with informational order. And we see lots of things that might be low entropy, but they don't have energy. Life has those two things in concert. Now, there are these dissipation theorems that say that can happen in very specific circumstances. And so Jeremy England wrote some articles saying, hey, maybe this is a way that this might show some promise for explaining the origin of life from purely physical thermodynamic considerations. What Brian showed, however, was that these same dissipation theorems show that to get low entropy and high thermal energy in the same system, you can do it, but you can only do it if you have an engine that converts energy in very specific ways to that low entropy system, and also only if you have information. So you need an engine and information. In fact, to build engines like ATP molecules inside cells, you've got to put a lot of proteins together in a very particular way, so you're going to need a lot of information. So you can get the order for free if you have the pre-existing information. And that's been the whole basis of our case for intelligent design in life, is that information is something that we know only arises from a mind, from an intelligence. So these dissipation theorems that look like they were going to provide an avenue for explaining the origin of life from fundamental physical principles actually just underscored in a new way the need for prior unexplained information that we think, again, can only be explained by reference to a mind.
Good, good. Well, thank you, and I'm gonna follow on that same thought. I'm speaking right now to Dr. Stephen Meyer, and so, Dr. Stephen Meyer, I'm gonna follow along that same thought. You know that I have not been.
I love these men. God bless these men, man. We need more men like these.
Been a proponent of intelligent design, though I'm quite sympathetic with the arguments. Neither have I contested with intelligent design. My whole argument has been I don't have a chemical tool to measure it, and I am holding my colleagues to using our chemical tools to define what they're proposing. So they tell these stories and they say, okay, well, what chemical tool did you use so that you could tell me this story? What was it that you measured? So what would you say to move me even closer toward intelligent design if I don't have a tool to measure it? What are the ways that are being thought about to really put a measure on this? Because your colleague, Dr. Brian Miller, told me that that's what they're moving toward.
Well, it's a great question, and this is what's been so enjoyable for me about our conversations is that, in a sense, we're looking at the same reality, at two sides of the same coin, because you've been analyzing these prebiotic simulation experiments and showing that the chemistry doesn't want to do what the origin of life biologists say it must do in order to produce life, right? It's not. It doesn't move in a life-friendly direction. In those first Miller-Urey experiments, unless there was the investigator interference to prevent the interfering cross reactions, the experiments would terminate in a substance called melanoidin, which was a kind of sludge that had absolutely nothing to do with life. So the investigator had to reach in and take out the byproducts that they didn't want and make sure that, that they didn't get those interfering cross reactions, and then introduce something else at just the right time. And still, we didn't get very far along the way. So you've just done this fantastic job with the benefit of your expertise in synthetic organic chemistry, of showing this fundamental truth that the chemistry, organic chemistry, does not move in a naturally in a life-friendly direction. And what you've done is you've called out these investigators for the way in which they've interfered with the experiments, where they've set them up, they've choreographed them, they've interfered, and use their own intelligence to get what limited positive results are possible. And so that, I think, has been a really powerful negative critique of the plausibility of these origin of life scenarios. What I've done in looking at the logic of origin of life simulation experiments and in the logic of historical scientific theorizing is to show that there's also a positive case for intelligent design. In part, it's based on something we can measure, and that is the amount of information that is present or would need to be present in even the simplest living cell. Because we have the ability to calculate very precisely the probabilistic resources of the entire universe. And I made some of these calculations in Signature in the Cell. So if you get beyond a particular threshold of information, we know that it will always be more likely that undirected material processes did not produce that information than it is that the undirected material processes did produce that information. And we're way beyond that threshold. And I unpack that quantitative threshold and the sort of probabilistic argument in Signature in the Cell. But there's more to the case for intelligent design than just the measurement of information. It's also our uniform and repeated experience of what it takes to generate information. And here I build in my case for intelligent design off of the work of Charles Darwin and the other 19th century historical scientists who developed a method of reasoning for investigating the events in the remote past and what caused those events. And their key insight was, if you want to explain an event in the remote past, you need to posit a cause which is known in our experience, in our present experience, to produce the effect in question. And I came across this first in the work of Darwin and then in Lyell. Lyell had a long Victorian subtitle on his famous book of Principles of Geology. It was being an attempt to explain the former changes of the Earth's surface by reference to causes now in operation. That's the critical methodological principle in historical science, and origin of life biology is an historical science. So if we want to figure out what caused life to come into existence, or what caused the information necessary to produce life, we need to ask, well, what is the cause now in operation that produces information? And as I began to frame that question, I realized we know of only one such cause that produces information, especially information in a digital form, such as the information we find in DNA and RNA. And that cause is an intelligent agent. Whether we're talking about a hieroglyphic inscription, or a paragraph in a book, or digital code in a computer program, or information embedded in a radio signal, whenever we trace information back to its ultimate source, we always come to a mind, not an undirected process. And now, curiously, even origin of life biochemists have confirmed this principle with their very simulation experiments that you've critiqued so powerfully. Because what they've shown is that to get, for example, there's a particular type of origin of life experiment called a ribozyme engineering experiment, where the origin of life scientists are trying to produce an RNA molecule that will both store information and catalyze reactions, and even hoping that they'll get one that can partially copy itself, a replicase, to get some kind of natural selection going at a prebiotic level. To date, they've been able to engineer RNA molecules that can copy about 10% of themselves. But to do that, the origin of life biochemist, the ribozyme engineer, has to precisely sequence the nucleotide bases on the RNA molecule to get even that limited self-replicating capacity, to make even that limited capacity possible. So what's being simulated? What's being simulated is that to generate information, you need a mind. Even RNA world experiments are showing this same principle, that intelligence is the prerequisite of information. And I remember years ago at that same conference, you gave that excellent talk on how information could exist in the cloud, because we can put it there. Because if there's a mind, you can put information in a cloud. It can be stored on any material medium. So I think both our ordinary experience and our scientific experience has confirmed this principle, that information always comes from a mind. So the discovery of information at the foundation of life therefore becomes a powerful indicator of prior intelligent activity, using the methodological principles and the scientific method of reasoning that Darwin himself employed in the Origin of Species. So a proper historical scientific inference.
Okay, well that sort of answers one of the first questions that's popped up from the audience. So now I'm gonna start reading off some questions from the audience, and there's several of them. So try to answer them fairly concisely, Steve. It says, Dr. Meyer, how would you combat somebody who believes in the multiverse, an infinite number of universes, so that life had to happen eventually?
Question.
Lots of physicists will now say, you've got a choice in how to interpret the fine-tuning evidence. You can either say it's the result of some kind of supermind, a theistic design interpretation, or you can opt for the multiverse. It's kind of a wash. The multiverse is the idea that there are billions of other universes out there, such that the incredible improbability associated with the fine-tuning of the laws and constants of physics and initial conditions of the universe that improbability gets massively diminished, because there are so many universes that the right conditions had to arise somewhere. The problem with this explanation, there's multiple problems, but the biggest one is this, that you can't just posit other universes, because if all the other universes are separate from ours, having no causal interaction, then things that happen in those other universes don't affect anything that happens in our universe, including the probabilities of the fine-tuning. So proponents of the sort of naturalistic approach to explaining the fine-tuning realize that, and realize that to explain the origin of the fine-tuning, they needed a universe-generating mechanism, something that would allow them to portray our universe as the outcome of a kind of cosmic lottery, in which the universe-generating mechanisms were spitting out lots of different universes, and would then ours just happen to be the lucky one, and that's where the rub comes in, because both of the speculative cosmologies that have been used to posit or to explain the multiverse, or to generate multiple universes. Inflationary cosmology and string theory require universe-generating mechanisms that themselves require prior unexplained fine-tuning. So in the inflationary universe, for example, the inflaton field has to shut off with just the right energies in just the right narrow window of time. And there's a very incredibly precise fine-tuning associated with that. So in order to explain fine-tuning, you posit a multiverse, but for the multiverse to actually explain fine-tuning, you need a universe-generating mechanism, but the universe-generating mechanisms require prior unexplained fine-tuning. So the multiverse doesn't really get rid of the fine-tuning, it just pushes it back one generation.
Good. I remember you and I were at a meeting one time together, and a Nobel laureate was pushed a little bit on giving an explanation for this, and he said, well, we're here, so it must have happened.
Yes, yeah.
And that was as good as he could get. And I remember you and I looked over at each other like, boy, we wish he had some more substance than that.
You get the same thing with the origin of life problem. Is since we're here, it must have evolved by chemical evolution, but we don't have a model and we don't have a plausible reaction, but since we're here, it must have happened. But what's assumed in that is that it must have happened materialistically. And there's obviously another alternative explanation. It may have been designed. Right. Same thing with the fine-tuning of the universe.
Right. So here's another question. It's this type of question that gets me angry, but you're a much calmer person than I am. A documentary I saw said it's possible to have the universe pop into existence on its own, entirely spontaneously, entirely uncaused, and entirely in accordance with the laws of physics. What's your answer to that?
Oh my goodness. Chicken or the egg?
Well, these questions are fun and great because I've just been writing on all of this. This is my new book, Return the God Hypothesis, is specifically addressing the counter-arguments to the fine-tuning argument, which is the multiverse, and the counter-arguments to the cosmological first cause argument, which is something called quantum cosmology, which is what the documentary was referring to. And the idea there is that the universe can be, when the universe is very, very small, inside what's called Planck time, it would have been small enough to be describable by the mathematics associated with quantum physics. And there's a couple of very weird paradoxes or strange things that come out of this. This has been invoked as a way of getting around the idea that of the Kalam first cause argument. Whatever begins to exist must have a cause. The universe began to exist. Therefore, the universe must have had a cause. Since causes are separate from themselves, the cause must be a transcendent cause, something beyond matter, space, time, and energy. That's been an increasingly popular argument, marshaled by people like William Lane Craig, based on the discovery that the universe did in fact have a beginning. This quantum cosmology stuff has been an attempt to circumvent that by saying, well, in the smallest smidgens of time, just after the beginning, the universe could have been described using quantum physics. And they use something called a universal wave function that describes all the possible states of affairs the universe might have had, and then it claim that if the universal wave function that comes out of these equations of quantum physics describes a universe like ours, as one of the possibilities, then it explains the origin of our universe. A couple weird problems though. Before there's a universe, the quantum cosmologists depict reality as essentially purely mathematical. It's simply this universal wave function. And one of the most perceptive of these physicists, Alexander Velinsky, has said, well, wait a minute. If before there's a physical universe, all there is this universal wave function describing mathematically all the possible universes that could exist, that's a purely mathematical reality. And math typically exists in minds. Are we then saying by our quantum cosmological modeling of the origin of the universe that the universe came out of a mind? He raises that as a rhetorical question in the last chapter of his book, Many Worlds in One, and never really answers it. Hawking, who also was a proponent of quantum cosmology, asked a similar question. He said, what puts fire in the equations that gives them a world to describe? Math by itself has no causal efficacy. It isn't something that causes things to happen. Math is something that exists in a mind that we use to describe things that happen in the world. So these types of explanations depend on the strange proposition that math produces matter. And that's very weird. And in fact, it seems to be almost Platonic and certainly a bit theistic, because math also, in our experience, only exists in the mind. And secondly, prior to all that, to get this universal wave function that's supposedly explaining the origin of the universe from math alone, there's a prior equation that has to be solved called the Wheeler-DeWitt equation. It's the analog of the Schrodinger equation from quantum physics. And that equation can't be solved unless the physicist chooses specific constraints on the equation. It otherwise has an infinite number of solutions unless the physicist constrains mathematical degrees of freedom by imposing what are called boundary conditions and boundary constraints. And those are always chosen with an end in mind, to get a universe out the other end like ours. So it's very much like the origin of life simulation experiments, where the simulator, in this case the mathematical modeler, is constraining possibilities, inputting information to get an outcome that he wants. So I think, again, what's actually being simulated is the need for a creator or a mind to bring a universe like ours into existence. So even those quantum cosmological explanations that say you get universe to pop into existence from the laws of physics alone presuppose some things that are really very theistic in their implications.
Indeed.
Okay, the next one. Is it possible God made other forms of life on other galaxies or universes with their own rules, i.e. Bible? If so, would that undermine the argument for intelligent design? Also, what about SETI program? Doesn't the method that we use to search for alien life argue for intelligent design?
Great question. Let me take the second one first. It's a bit more straightforward. The SETI method is in fact predicated on the assumption that information in the digital and specified form that we define carefully among ID proponents is a definitive indicator of intelligence. So they're looking for things like the prime number sequence, okay, something like that. And if they find it, they're going to say, that's an intelligent agent. That's information embedded in a radio signal. So the presupposition of SETI is that information, specified complexity, is an indicator of intelligent activity. They haven't found that yet in any radio signal or any other signal coming from outer space. But it's interesting that it presupposes the very method of design detection that's used by intelligent design proponents. And that, secondly, we found that kind of information at the foundation of life in DNA and RNA and proteins. As for life on another planet, I think, or in probably other galaxies, we know there is no life on the other planets in our solar system. We have now found some extrasolar planets, but as I understand it, they have highly eccentric orbits. All the ones that have been identified are not life-friendly, in that they pass way too close and come way too far away from their host suns. The temperature variations are too great. But if life were found on another planet, I don't think that would undermine the case for intelligent design. Likely, if we studied that life, it would require prior foundational information as well, and that would be an indicator of intelligent design. We don't have any indication from science or from the Bible that there is life in other places, but it's not impossible from either perspective. So I'm open to that, and I don't think it's dispositive for the question of intelligent design one way or another. Should we find it? We haven't yet.
You're really good at answering these. Dr. Meyer, what arguments do naturalists/materialists think are practical in understanding that the material world as we know it had a beginning / the Big Bang?
Well, that's another great question, and it's a wonderful story of how we discovered the beginning. Jim and I were at a conference a couple summers ago with a French astrophysicist, Jean-Pierre Luminet, who's written a book in French about the invention of the Big Bang, and its fascinating story. The key evidence, I think, the first big evidence, was the discovery that the galaxies are moving away from us, and that was the evidence of that was provided by the red shift. The spectral signatures of the light coming from distant galaxies were shifted in the red end of the ultraviolet spectrum and the red end is the longer wavelengths, so that suggested that the light was being stretched out. Light gets stretched out as objects move away, and so as the astronomers began to survey the night sky, they found in every quadrant of the night sky there was the light coming from the distant galaxies was shifted in that red direction, with a few anomalies here and there, but overwhelming testimony of an expanding universe. So that was the first big thing. The other thing, the other really big indicator came out of theoretical physics with Einstein's theory of general relativity and the field equations of general relativity that were later solved by Hawking and Penrose and George Ellis. And this suggested that Einstein's theory was that matter curved space, and he knew that if gravitation was the only force in the universe, then we should have long ago collapsed in on, all the matter should have collapsed in on itself, and we should have a kind of giant black hole. But since we don't live in that kind of universe, we live in a universe with celestial bodies with a great deal of space between them, there must be some counteracting force of expansion. And if there's an expanding force, then that implies most likely that we live in a dynamic universe that is expanding in size. And Einstein didn't like that implication at first. He tried to gerrymander the forces with something called the cosmological constant, and give it exactly the right value so that the expanding force and the contracting force were just right. But that level of fine-tuning was implausible, and it didn't work. And then later they found the evidence of the expansion with the red shift. Then there were a whole series of other evidences that came online, the cosmic background radiation and others. So the evidence for the Big Bang is, I think, widely accepted by scientists of all philosophical persuasions. The question is, what do you make of it philosophically? I think the beginning implies a transcendent cause beyond matter, space, time, and energy. I think it does provide, I think the discovery does have theistic implications.
Okay. Some people believe that Scripture supports the theory that God created the earth, but then the earth was destroyed, i.e. Satan's fall, and then God recreated the earth. What's your opinion?
I've not heard too much about that. I would say that in the proponents of intelligent design come in lots of different philosophical persuasions. Most are theists, but some are agnostics. I happen to be a Christian and a proponent of intelligent design, and I think a biblical understanding of design in nature or of nature is twofold. We should expect from a biblical point of view to see evidence of design, original design or aboriginal design, but from a biblical point of view we should also expect to see evidence of decay. In fact, I think in Romans it says that the nature is in bondage to decay, the created order is in bondage to decay. And so I become very interested in the evidence we have of both of those things. And I think without getting into a very detailed what's called a theodicy of how evil entered the world, and theologians think about that a lot, I think generally we see exactly what we ought to expect from a biblical point of view. We see exquisite evidence of design, but we see evidence of that design being eroded or decayed or degraded, or of degradation. And we have a colleague at University of Idaho, Scott Minnick, who works on virulence, and he tells me that among microbiologists who look at virulent bacteria and viruses that are nasty to humans, that invariably what you have is either an information loss from an aboriginal system that wasn't harmful to us, or information being expressed out of its original and proper context. So I think that we're seeing at a microbiological level both evidence of design and evidence of subsequent decay. That's, after all, what a mutation is. So I think the biblical natural theology or theology of nature comports well with what we see in nature.
Okay. That dovetails right into this question. All the recent talk of viruses has caused me to wonder about the idea of God breathing life into Adam. While Adam would already need to be alive to be affected by viruses as we understand them, this causes me to ponder how God breathing life into Adam could have been a far more literal process than I've previously considered. To borrow a phrase from the Green Mile, could God have somehow infected us with life? And could viruses be a key to understanding how something like this might have happened?
Very interesting. This dovetails beautifully with the previous question. Scott Minnick has shown that, for example, the plague bacterium, and we're not talking about viruses yet, but the plague bacterium, which has been a very striking example of what theologians call natural evil, it is the result of 4 discernible mutations from an aboriginal bacterium for which our bodies had a natural immune response. It was a completely benign bacterium that was altered by this series of mutations. So that would be an example of that kind of decay or degradation of a beautifully and well-designed original system. Now, we have another colleague, Don Ewart, who's a virologist, who's working on this same issue. Viruses cause a lot of problems, so what happened? Were they originally designed, or were they... And he's working on a theory, and there's quite a lot of support for this in general, that viruses have had an original role of effectively they were part of an information processing system that maintained the proper balance of different bacterial organisms, for example, in the human gut or in the gut of other mammals, that we need a particular balance of different bacterial species, and that viruses were a way of transferring genetic information laterally to maintain this proper balance of different species of bacteria in the larger bacterial populations. So that's a new idea and a new take on this, but it's very interesting, and he's working on a very detailed paper on that and finding a lot that supports it. So it's a kind of an active area of interest for ID proponents. The bacterial question is making a lot of sense as far as evidence of design and decay, and there's an interesting avenue of research developing, or an interesting hypothesis that's being developed about viruses. So stay tuned on that. It shows how the ID concept is generating a lot of new research ideas.
Okay. As a philosopher of science, what do you think is the best way to differentiate scientific, philosophical, and religious questions and issues? Where do questions of design fit in?
The second question is a bit easier to answer than the first. I think questions of design are questions of historical scientific research. You can use the method I described a bit earlier. It's called the method of multiple competing hypotheses. It's used as a standard method in geology, evolutionary biology, archaeology. It's a method that's used when you can't repeat something under controlled laboratory conditions necessarily, and where you need to make an inference about past causes of events or make an inference to determine the cause of an event in the remote past. And so design detection is a retrodictive inference. We look at an effect and try to determine what type of cause best explains it. Was it chance? Was it natural laws or necessity? Was it some combination of the two? Or was it an intelligent agent? All of those are possibilities. We know that intelligent agents act, and they leave certain types of signatures of their activity behind. When we find those signatures, it allows us to retrodict back to a designing mind. I think the crucial signature of intelligence is information. And so I think that's the type of inquiry that allows you to detect design. That's a type of forensic science or historical science. It's part of what I characterized in my PhD thesis, and I've done a fair amount of further writing on that in the books that Jim kindly showed at the beginning of the interview. So that's the kind of science I think intelligent design is. It's different than straight bench science or theoretical physics. There are different types of sciences with different types of methods. And then that gets to the second question: how do we characterize science? Typically, in an undergraduate science class, we'll learn about the scientific method. But in fact, there are many different scientific methods. There's sciences that are concerned with classification. There are sciences that are concerned with simulation. There are sciences that are concerned with the formulation of general physical laws. There are sciences that are more forensic in character, that are trying to discern provide causal explanations for particular facts or particular events. And all of these different types of sciences have different methods. And so the simplistic hypothetico-deductive method that we all learn in, physics 110 or chemistry 101, that's a good method, but it's not the only method of scientific reasoning. And so recognizing that there is a multiplicity of methods makes it difficult to say how in general we distinguish science from philosophy or religion. And that's something in philosophy of science known as the demarcation problem. It's a notoriously difficult thing to give a simple definition of science that allows us to distinguish science from these other modes of inquiry, especially because some of those modes of inquiry in philosophy and philosophy of science, that method of multiple competing hypotheses and inferring to the best explanation is used just as it's used in the historical sciences or sometimes in theoretical physics. So I'm of the opinion that there's not as much clear demarcation between the natural sciences and philosophy or philosophy of science as one might think. And even in religion, we were talking at the very beginning of the interview about the resurrection. The case for the resurrection is based on historical evidence, and it uses the same method of reasoning, namely inference to the best explanation. The apologetic case for the resurrection uses the same method of reasoning that Darwin used in The Origin of Species, the method of inference to the best explanation, trying to explain what caused a particular fact or set of facts to arise in history. So it's difficult to form a strict demarcation. I think it's easier to demarcate different types of scientific reasoning and different types of philosophical reasoning than to give one clear-cut science versus philosophy sort of demarcation. But I write about that a fair bit in the end of Signature in the Cell, and I give a more complete account of this problem of definition. The key thing, though, is not how do you define an argument or how do you define a truth claim, but whether or not the truth claim is true or false. Is the argument valid or sound? So the case for it doesn't so much matter whether the case for intelligent design is science or philosophy or a combination of the two, or historical science. What's of most concern is whether or not it's true. Does the evidence support the claim based on our knowledge of cause and effect and so forth?
That's right.
Wow.
Sorry,
you're amazing.
That wasn't very
Steve.
succinct.
No. You're
Well,
amazing.
you are too.
Just
These
amazing.
are great questions.
They are.
So somebody's asked me a question. The next question that's up here is to me, and I'm not even sure I can answer it. So it says, Dr. Tour, do you find the method of competing hypotheses that Meyer presents for the origin of life an adequate test? Stephen knows this. I look at this somewhat differently than would a philosopher of science. I just look at the chemistry, and it is glaring to me that even with all of the input of the investigator, they still don't even get close, because as human beings, we have no idea how to even influence the system to make it happen. So I don't know how to really answer your question to me. I just look at this very differently as somebody who just has to make stuff all day, rather than thinking about the deep implications of it. Other than that, we have no idea how to do it. Steve, help me out here.
Yeah, let me run at that, because I think actually our two ways of looking this just dovetail beautifully. And in fact, what you're in the framework of the method of multiple competing hypotheses, what you've determined is that these proposed explanations for in prebiotic synthesis of whether it's sugars or amino acids or metabolic pathways or whatever, that these proposed hypotheses lack causal
Metabolic pathways. Whoa, what is that?
adequacy. They're not consistent with what we know about what ordinarily happens in chemistry. So if you take Lyell's dictum that the present is the key to the past, and we look at what chemistry does now, These hypotheses, positing certain chemical processes as the basis for the organic synthesis of the prebiotic monomers or polymers or whatever, we can say those hypotheses are not causally adequate. They don't meet the test of experience. They're not consistent with our uniform and repeated experience of what chemistry does in the present. We don't have a cause now in operation that produces the thing that needs to be explained. So that what you're doing fits beautifully into the methodological framework that Origin of Life people use. They say they use, although they often punt when they don't get the answer they want. But it fits into the methodological characterization of the field that I've provided, and that same methodological framework is the basis, I argue, for making a positive inference for intelligent design. So we're on the same page here. I'm just doing a little bit of self-conscious characterization of the underlying methodology, and you're just saying as a chemist, gee, this flat doesn't work. And saying it flat doesn't work is another way of saying it lacks causal adequacy. What they're positing as the cause doesn't produce the effect that's needed to produce life.
There you go. There's one final question here, and we're going to close with this one, and it's actually related to the way you just finished. They're asking, Dr. Meyer, what's the difference between life and consciousness?
Tough question.
Well, maybe we just stumped the questioner or the question responder. Well, there are many forms of life that are exhibit aversive responses to stimuli, to which we would not attribute either sentience or consciousness. So there are one-celled bacteria we do not think exhibit characteristics of conscious agency. We know of consciousness. This is a great point that our colleague J.P. Moreland at Biola University makes. We know of the reality of consciousness because we are conscious minds ourselves. We have direct introspective experience of what it means to be a conscious mind. And much of the rest of our knowledge of the world is derived indirectly or inferentially from that first-person knowledge of being a conscious agent. So because we understand intuitively the connection between our own conscious awareness and the kinds of outcomes or behaviors that we can affect. I can pick up a ball and throw it because I have an intention to throw a strike across the plate. I can write a sentence because I mean to communicate something. So I can infer the existence of other conscious minds because I can see the distinctive effects of my own consciousness being expressed by other conscious minds. I can also see that there are other types of organisms that exhibit lifelike behaviors that are responding to their environment in various ways that don't exhibit the distinctive effects of conscious awareness. And so we've made this distinction. It seems pretty intuitive and obvious, but we can unpack it if we think about it real carefully between consciousness, sentience, and mere vitality. And there's a kind of a hierarchy in life, and we realize that some forms of life have consciousness like we do. Animals have a form of animal consciousness. In the Bible, they're called the nephesh. They have a mind, but not a spirit. And then there are things like bacteria and plants that have clearly exhibit lifelike characteristics without that. So I think that's about the best we can do. I don't know if we can get a great definition, but what we know of consciousness, I think we know very well. And a lot of the problem of materialism in science is that we want to say mind is somehow not a factor, but scientists who say that forget the role of their own minds. They're impervious to the role of their own minds, and I think that's a mistake, and it shows up in particular in Origin of Life chemistry, where the mind of the scientist is the crucial factor driving the chemistry forward, and yet the scientist is completely oblivious to that.
Well, I agree with that.
I might be talking myself into a
hole. We'll stop there. I agree with that, Dr. Stephen Meyer. I agree with that scientists are really oblivious to their own consciousness and what's going on in the experiments that they do in this area. And one day I was building what was called a synthetic brain, and this was right around 2000, 2001, in that time period under a DARPA contract. And I had said that we were going to build this brain, and it was going to be semi-conscious, knowing from computer science that to define consciousness is very hard. So I called it semi-conscious. And at that point, I knew nobody was going to argue with me because it was too complex to figure out what I might have meant. But Steve, I want to thank you so much for joining us on this beginning podcast that I have, the Science and Faith podcast with Dr. James Tour. You've just brought out so much, and it's just fun listening to you and your ability to pull from philosophy and science across from the geological to the biological and the chemical, and just pack all this together in a single talk after talking to us about the physical resurrection of Jesus Christ, which is absolutely.
Now,
sorry. That was about it. I hope you liked it. Now we're going to continue with a different one. Also philosophical, deep. Let's go.
Tonight's conversation. A special welcome to those of you who are joining us on the live stream, either from Chicago or elsewhere. I am Isabella. I am a senior here at Rice. I'm studying computer science, and it is my absolute pleasure to get to introduce y'all to the speakers for tonight. And so I'm going to move over here so you can see them better. And so this is Dr. Tor. And he is the T.T. and W.F. Chow Professor of Chemistry, Professor of Computer Science, and Professor of Material Science and Nanoengineering. He has over 785 published articles. He has over 130 patents with 100 pending. He also has an incredibly long list of accomplishments, including the Osper Prize, the Royal Society of Chemistry Centenary Prize, and the Trotter Prize. In 2019, he was named in the 50 most influential scientists in the world by thebestschools.org. And our honored guest, Dr. Lennox, is the Emeritus Professor of Mathematics at Oxford University. And he is an internationally renowned speaker and author of many books on the interface of science, philosophy, and religion. He has over 70 published articles on mathematics. He has co-authored 2 mathematical monographs for Oxford, and he also has translated Russian mathematics. And we are also just so glad to have Dr. Lennox again. He has come many times, had the invitation of Dr. Tor, and has always packed out rooms. And tonight's program will begin with the stories of faith of Dr. Tor and Dr. Lennox, and then we're going to move into a conversation about Dr. Lennox's book, Can Science Explain Everything? And then they will wrap up with a Q&A session moderated by Rice alumnus Zach McCrae. And so we are just so glad to get to hear all of this. And Dr. Lennox, would you get us started?
Thank you. Well, ladies and gentlemen, it's an honor for me to be back at Rice and to be sitting beside a very intelligent person whose publication record is at least 10 times mine. And I look forward very much this evening to the discussion. The famous philosopher Immanuel Kant said that there are 3 fundamental questions that we need to answer. What can I know? What can I hope for? And what must I do? And as I travel these days and particularly talk to students and young people, I find there's an aura of hopelessness in many people's minds and hearts. The awful wars that are going on, the various crises at the level of climate, the fires, the poverty, and everything else means that people increasingly ask Kant's second question, is there any hope? And the poet Emily Dickinson wrote a lovely poem about hope. Hope, she said, hope is the thing with feathers that perches in the soul and sings the tune without the words and never stops at all. And sweetest in the gale is heard, and sore must be the storm that could abash the little bird that kept so many warm. I've heard it in the chillest land and on the strangest sea, yet never in extremity it asked a crumb of me. And in this famous poem, Emily Dickinson, she often does, takes an abstract concept and likens it to something physical, visible, and tangible, so that here she represents hope by a singing bird singing a wordless tune that never stops. So her view is that hope does not speak to us in any conventional way. It is a sense, not always a rational one, that cheers us even in the darkness and despair of a fierce storm. Hope, in her view, can withstand just about anything, even in the chillest land or far from home in the strangest sea. It provides comfort and solace and doesn't ask anything back. And George MacDonald, who influenced C.S. Lewis so much, once wrote, "Though the sky be dim, my hope is in the sky." Now, the Oxford English Dictionary, which I respect because it's written and published at my own university, defines hope to be the expectation of something desired, a feeling of trust or confidence. And the word can be also used ironically for something that has little chance of being realized. For example, there's some hope of him passing that exam. It can also denote a person or thing that gives hope, or in which hopes are placed. And I want to be very upfront with you. I'm nearly 80 years old. And after a lifetime, I have no hesitation of saying to you, as a scientist and a Christian, that my greatest hope is the hope of glory, because Jesus Christ is within me. That may sound very strange to you, but I've got a real expectation for the future, an ultimate expectation that transcends all the misery of this earth, because it's rooted outside this world. Now, expectation and hope are not quite the same. If I have aggressive cancer, and I have some kind of cancer, I might well expect to die. And yet, my hope transcends death. Now, the question of time is important as we look towards the future, because you see, the past, our knowledge and memory of the past gives us identity, and our hopes for the future give us meaning, in the sense of giving us something to live for. And both of these relate to the very important question for each of us: what does it mean to flourish as a human being? And it's interesting to me that some of the leading universities in the world, particularly Yale, have got a department dedicated to what human flourishing is.
Interesting.
Now, I'm a Christian because the Christian message is, to my mind, the only message that brings ultimate hope. And what authenticates Jesus' claim to be the Son of God who gave his life for us is his resurrection from the dead. And I believe that firmly as a scientist. And one of the early apostles explains this to us. And he writes this to Christians, but we can all listen. "Blessed be the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ. According to his great mercy, he has caused us to be born again to a living hope through the resurrection of Jesus Christ from the dead."
Living hope,
now,
true
the
hope.
Bible is unique in giving us a narrative with real explanatory power that's big enough to give a framework in which we can not only live but flourish. It's a meta-narrative. It spans the whole of history, from the beginning to the end. It starts with God creating the universe and making human beings, male and female, in his own image. That is a staggering fact. The universe, and I'm an amateur astronomer, shows God's glory. It wasn't made in his image. You were. And that gives you an infinite, immeasurable dignity. Jordan Peterson was once commenting on this, and he came across this statement in Genesis about human beings being made in the image of God. And he said this, he paused and he said, man, he said, this fact is the cornerstone of our civilization. It's the fundamental base of all value, and we neglect it at our peril.
Interesting.
And part of the hopelessness of our society, ladies and gentlemen, is that whereas for millennia, God has been at the center of moral values and hope, we have seen fit to jettison God and hope that we can retain some value. And I've been in Russia many times, and I remember an academician saying to me quietly, he said, you know, we made a huge mistake. We thought that we could get rid of God and maintain a value for human beings, and we found out too late that we could not. And loss of the biblical root of our culture, and let's not forget it, our culture owes a huge amount to the Judeo-Christian tradition. Our universities, Harvard, you know what its motto is, don't you? Veritas. But they cut it short. That wasn't its original motto. Its original motto was Veritas in Christo et Ecclesia. That is truth in Christ and the church. And my University of Oxford similarly has a biblical motto, because the people that founded these universities saw that God and learning went together. They weren't divorced. And I maintain that very strongly today. But by getting rid of God, it hasn't improved our culture, and it's led to widespread disorientation, especially among young people, hopelessness. Many people have been completely duped by a God-denying, authoritarian, naturalistic worldview into believing that they are nothing more than a highly organized arrangement of chemicals without ultimate meaning. And the tendency is that because we've been pressurized and confined into a naturalistic world, we try to find meaning inside it because there's no other place to look. But the philosopher Wittgenstein, who was extremely bright, once said, the meaning of the world will not be found within the world. The meaning of a system won't be found inside the system. The meaning of a computer won't be found inside a computer. The meaning transcends it. And there's a brilliant book being written by a neuroscientist, Ian McGilchrist, recently called The Matter with Things. And he says, why is it we're in a universe today where we understand how almost everything works and what it's made of, but we understand the meaning of nothing? And he has studied our brains. We've got two halves to our brains. I hope most of you have anyway. And he has, with neuroscientific research, discovered that there's a lot of truth in the idea. You know, people say he's left-brained, he's a bit of a nerd, or she's right-brained, her head's always in the artistic clouds. And what he's discovered is the two halves of our brain perceive reality differently. The left side sees us as things. The right side sees us as persons. And he develops this, and he says, and this is the important thing, that for the last 500 years, we've put such an emphasis on the left side of the brain that we're left in a world where we understand how things work and we understand the meaning of nothing. And we need to look outside the world and start using the right side of our brains. And I asked McGilchrist, I said, does that mean that Richard Dawkins is half-brained? And he said, you could say so. And it's a serious point. We're neglecting the whole brain, holistic approach. So it's a fascinating actual book. So having lost any grip on divine transcendence, we look inside ourselves, and what do we find? A conflicting mass of emotions and desires, and we wonder, lost, in a culture that devalues truth, ethics, and human life. And meaning becomes more and more dependent on connection through social media. So where can we find hope? Well, the brilliant historian Tom Holland, in his book Dominion, The Making of the Western Mind, tells us that he once thought that all the good things in our society, our values of our institutions, our democratic rights, our human rights, came from the Greeks and the Romans. And he gradually realized that this was not the case. It was the biblical worldview that actually had underpinned life in the West for centuries. And so we've every reason not to be ashamed of the immense impact of Christianity on our culture. And influential atheists realize this, like Jürgen Habermas, who says that our ideals of freedom and individual morality and human rights and so on are the direct legacy of the Judaic ethic of justice and the Christian ethic of love. To this day, there's no alternative. Everything else is just postmodern talk. So, over a century ago, hard atheist Friedrich Nietzsche wrote with great clarity something that many of the softer atheists like Dawkins do not grasp. When one gives up the Christian faith, he wrote, one pulls the right to Christian morality from under one's feet, as if morality could survive when the God who sanctioned it is missing. So if we're going to understand Western culture, we cannot avoid considering the Christian world view. And that is hugely important. Now, my first encounter with it was in my parental home in Ireland, where my parents were credible Christians. What do I mean by that? They lived as if there was a God above them. My father would apologize to us kids if he felt he was too strict. And in a very sectarian, troubled Ireland, where the two cultures were fighting each other, he employed Protestants and Catholics equally in his store, and he was bombed for it. My brother was nearly killed. And I said, Dad, why do you do it? And he said, listen, he said, the Bible teaches that every man and woman, irrespective of their worldview, is made in the image of God, and I intend to treat them like that. And that affected me deeply. The second thing was that my father and mother loved me enough to allow me space to think. And so I could come to the Christian faith, which he opened up to me as an expansive meta-narrative that was fascinating in its own right. And then he presented me with the Communist Manifesto when I was 14, and I asked him, had he read it? And he said, no. And I said, why should I read it? He said, you need to know what other people think. And I spent my life exposing my Christian faith to its opposite. Now, coming to the heart of this, I believe that Christianity is good news. Why? Well, here's Tom Holland, who's moving rapidly towards theism. And he says in his book that what he found was that the heart of the gospel was its revolutionary teaching about the death of Jesus on the cross. And that is amazing. Listen to what he wrote. Here's a secular historian writing about what he discovers. If Paul could not leave the sheer wonder of this alone, if he risked everything to proclaim it to strangers, likely to find it disgusting or lunatic or both, then that was because he had been brought by his vision of the risen Jesus to gaze directly into what it meant for him and for all the world. That Christ, whose participation in the divine sovereignty over space and time, he, Paul, never seems to have doubted, had become human and suffered death on the ultimate instrument of torture, was precisely the measure of his understanding of God, that he was love. The world stood transformed as a result. Such was the gospel. Paul, in proclaiming it, offered himself as the surest measure of its truth. He was nothing, worse than nothing, a man who had persecuted Christ's followers, foolish and despised. And yet he had been forgiven and saved. I live by faith in the Son of God who loved me and gave himself for me. And if Paul, then why not everyone else, says Holland. Why not indeed? Paul wasn't ashamed of the gospel. because it's the power of God unto salvation. And you know, as my final point, because my time has run, I want to say this, that many people say to me, you're a scientist, Christianity is not testable. It is, because Christ promises people things. The risen Christ promises that if we face the mess we've made of our own lives, and sadly sometimes the lives of others, he will give us peace. I meet many people, particularly students, they have no peace. He will give us forgiveness because he died for us. And many people have consciences absolutely full of guilt of the things they've seen, the things they've done, and so on. But then he'll also give us something even more. He will give us the power to live the kind of life that we know in our hearts we'd like to live. Why do I believe this, folks? Because I believe that as a fact of history, Jesus Christ is still alive today because 20 centuries ago, God raised him from the dead.
Amen.
That's why I believe it. And so I turn to Dr. Tour to tell us about that. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you, John. Thank you for coming to Rice. I mean, we are really, really blessed to be able to have you here. Let me follow up on that a little bit with my background. I didn't grow up in a Christian home. I grew up in a secular Jewish home. We were not particularly practicing Jews, just like many Jews are not particularly practicing. Many Baptists are not particularly practicing. We went to synagogue about twice a year, like some Baptists go twice a year.
Stop it.
We did the same sort of thing. I was being interviewed just recently, and she said, you know, I told this woman who was interviewing me that I came to a knowledge of Jesus Christ when I was 18, shortly after I came to college. She said, you must have been thinking a lot about the cosmological argument and pondering these things as a high school student. I said, I was just thinking about women. I mean, that's all I was really thinking about. There was nothing deep about what I was thinking about. And then, so I wasn't one of these pondering people and pensive and wondering about the things of life. But a young man, we were in the laundry room, and it was August of my freshman year, and it had to be the first load of laundry that I ever did because my mother always did it for me at home. And here I was at college trying to figure out how to wash my clothes, and there was another guy in there. We got to talking. I said, what are you going to do when you graduate? He was on the football team. I asked him if he was going to play ball, and he says, oh, no, I'm not good enough for that. I said, what are you going to do? He said, lay ministry. I said, what's that? He said, sort of like a missionary. We secular Jews don't have missionaries. I didn't even know missionaries existed. I thought American Indians probably killed them all off. I never heard of a missionary. I never met a missionary. And so I said, why do we need missionaries? We just got TV. This is 1977. You just beam it right in. And he said, do you mind if I give you a presentation of the gospel? And I didn't know what he meant. I mean, sure, go ahead. And so he opened up his Bible, and he drew a little picture of a man on one side and God on the other, and a chasm of sin separating us. And he opened up his Bible and said, for all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. And I said, I'm not a sinner. He was a bit surprised. I said, I'm not. I said, I never killed anybody. I never robbed a bank. How could I be a sinner? In modern secular Judaism, it's not little things that make you a sinner. It's not this Christian thing like, I just sinned again. It's terrible. It's just blissfully unaware of any of this. It's very calm. As long as you don't rob banks or kill people, you're not a sinner. And then he turned to a verse in Matthew chapter 5, verse 28. And it says, Jesus said, if you look at a woman with lust for her, you've already committed adultery with her in your heart.
He elevated it.
And that really hit me. It really hit me because I was addicted to pornography from the age of 14. I started working in a gas station just outside New York City on the highway, and men would throw away their magazines, and I'd pick them up. And why should I even care what some guy 2,000 years ago said? I didn't know Jesus was Jewish. Did you know Jesus was Jewish? Who knew? The rabbis told us that Jesus was Christian. They did. I didn't know Jesus was Jewish. And
Making a good point.
so why should I even care? But what happens is, when Jesus is getting hold of your heart, his words have enormous power. And all of a sudden, I was convicted of my sin for the first time in my life. And I said, if I just look at a woman with lust for her, I didn't know how to look at a woman any other way. That's the only way I knew. And then you've committed adultery with her already in your heart. And I knew adultery was wrong. That was one of the 10 commandments. And all of a sudden, he had my attention. Then he goes through the gospel message of how there's nothing that I can do to deliver myself from my sin.
True.
But God has paid the price by coming to this earth in the form of a man named Jesus Christ. It means it's God. It's God trying to reach out to us. You know, there were these guys in college, they had tropical fish. I don't know if any of you own tropical fish, but if you don't get them. They're terrible. And these guys, they would have special foods, special rocks, special lights, pH had to be just right, salinity, and they died all the time, but they were beautiful. And every time the guy would go near the fish tank, the fish would swim behind the rocks. He could never get a good look. And he said, you know, I wish I could become a fish. And I could just tell them that I'm not going to hurt them, that this person means no harm to them. He just wants to enjoy them. And it's very much like that with God, that he wants to have relationship with us. So he says, I'll come as a man, but if I'm just come as a man, they'll still fear me. But I'll be born among them, and I'll grow up among them. It's an amazing story. And I'm just listening to this story. And then this man says, I will take the death that you deserve because of your sin, because the wages of sin is death, the Bible says. But the free gift of God is eternal life in Christ Jesus our Lord. I'll take that death, Jesus said. It's an amazing picture of love. If any of you are parents.
I think this is still what his friend was telling him. The presentation.
You know the way you would defend your child to the death. You would give your life 100 times, if you could, for your child. And he gave his life for us. And I heard this message. And then he rose from the dead. This is the thing that gives hope. Jesus rose from the dead. Look at scriptural evidence. Jesus appeared in the morning. It wasn't a foggy night. In the morning, he appeared to a group of women, first a woman, Mary, and then another group of women. He appeared to his disciples. He appeared to people over a period of 40 days, over 500 people at one time. And hallucinations are never shared. So if these people are hallucinating, they're not going to be sharing it, certainly not 500 people. And Paul said, you go and ask the people. They're alive today. Go ask them. When he first appeared to his disciples, it says they thought they were seeing just like a ghost. Jesus said, no, come here. Come here. I want you to touch me. See, I have flesh and bones. You see, I have. I want you to touch me. And he says, you got something here to eat? And they gave him a piece of fish, and he ate it. He ate it right in front of them. And when he first appeared to his disciples, they were all there except Thomas wasn't there. And they told Thomas, hey, we've seen the risen Savior. Thomas is like, come on. I don't believe that. Must be an imposter, you know, some guy, white robe, beard, long hair. He said, I'm not going to believe it unless I stick my finger into the hole in his hands. And unless I stick my hand into the hole in his side, because when Jesus was on the cross, they wanted to make sure he was dead. He was dead for many hours, but they still wanted to make sure. It says a Roman soldier thrust his spear into the side of Jesus, and blood and water came out. Jesus is up high on the cross, the soldier's down here, 6-foot spear, thrust it into the side, probably under the rib cage, hit the main artery of the heart, blood and water gushed out. Why blood and water? The blood had already coagulated. You get this gelatinous phase of blood, and you get this aqueous phase that's just kind of pink, watery. That came out. He had been dead for hours. This is what the Bible references. This is what it talks about. It is into that hole that Thomas said, I'm going to have to stick my hand. Jesus appears to them again. He says, then Thomas is among them. He says, Thomas, come here. I want you to stick your finger into the hole in my hand. Now I want you to stick your hand into the hole in my side. Thomas is probably like, it's okay. Jesus said, Jesus commanded him, the risen Savior, stick your hand into the hole in my side. How could he resist? This is the risen Savior. Thomas sticks his hand in. It's deeper. No imposter is walking around with a hole in their side big enough for a man to insert his hand and inviting people to insert their hand into it. Jesus had risen from the dead. Jesus appeared to them in Jerusalem, in Emmaus, the road between Jerusalem and Emmaus. He appeared to them up in the north, in the Galilee, indoors, out of doors. Over 40 days, he had a picnic with them on the beach. He cooked for them. But there's also extra biblical evidence. There's evidence from the writings of that century. There was Tacitus, who was a historian. He was a brutal historian. He wrote, if he didn't like you, he wrote amazing things about you. But he wrote accurately. He's the one that tells us that Nero was the one who set Rome on fire, tried to blame it on the Christians. But he says, we all know Nero did this. He wrote of how they were putting Christians to death. They would take fresh animal skins and tie it to them and throw them to wild dogs. But they were not recanting this confession that Jesus was alive. Pliny the Younger in Asia Minor, which is current-day Turkey, he was a governor there. He's putting Christians to death. And he writes a letter to Trajan. We have that letter. Trajan was the emperor at the time. He says, I'm putting all these Christians to death. Am I doing the right thing? They won't worship your image. They're worshiping Jesus as if he's alive. They say he's alive. Trajan writes a much shorter letter back. He says, yes, kill them. If they won't worship my image, if they won't recant their confession, put them to death. We have writings of the apostles on how they died. Some apostles, Peter was crucified upside down. One was boiled in oil. Another was flayed alive, where they pin you to the ground and they peel the skin off you like they're fish. What's amazing is that these people were not dying for what they believed. I would die for what I believe. John would die for what he believes. Lots of people die for what they believe. Nothing unique about that. These people were not dying for what they believed to be true. They were dying for what they knew to be true because they saw it with their own eyes. And nobody dies for what they know to be a lie. They'd be boiling that oil and the guy would be like, psych, April Fools, let me tell you where we hid the body. They're not going to die for this. This is a compelling argument. Jesus rose from the dead. In this we have tremendous hope. I don't know what it's like growing up in your generation. I mean, in my generation, I remember we were hiding under desks because the Russians were going to bomb us, and we would, practice jumping under our desks, and the kids giggling. I mean, I don't know what it's like to grow up in this generation, but I know that there's hope in Christ. There's hope in Him. Jesus has risen from the dead. And you know how I know that you embrace the resurrection? That God has impressed the resurrection already on your heart? It's already there. It's already there. Because you're here tonight. If the resurrection were not already written on your heart, you wouldn't waste your time with this. You'd be somewhere else. The truth of the resurrection is already there. It's already on your heart. And all I'm asking you to do is to confess to that which is already there. The truth of the resurrection. Jesus is risen from the dead. And in that, we have great hope. That is the fundamental behind the Christian faith. That Jesus has given Himself for us. He died on our behalf. He was buried and He rose from the dead. In His resurrection from the dead, it shows that He can take us with Him. And that's what He promised. I will take you with me. I will take you with me. If you are here tonight, I call you to confess to that truth, that He's already risen from the dead. The truth of the resurrection is already there. That's my story. That's my testimony. And that's what's impacted my life and been the governing force in my life, is that Jesus Christ has risen from the dead. And I love Him so much.
Good man.
Thank you. Now we're going to get to John's book. Can science explain everything? Now, I'm a scientist, and I think I know the answer to this, all right? But we're going to go through this because, and I've read this before, and I reread it again. And so, John, tell us, can you be a scientist and believe in God? Can a real scientist, are you always going to be a lousy scientist if you believe in God?
Lousy scientist.
Well, I think there are two examples of the contrary sitting in front of this audience. The relationship between science and God is a very deep one, actually. And even asking that question can show that we don't know much about our history, because science, modern science, is really a gift of the biblical worldview to the world. You think back of the pioneers of modern science. So you start with Galileo, and then you've got Kepler, Newton, and you come on up through Faraday, Clark Maxwell, and so on. All of them were believers of God. And C.S. Lewis put it very succinctly when he said men became scientific. Why? Because they expected law in nature. And they expected law in nature because they believed in a legislator. So that's the first thing that brings them together in my mind. And what I discover is that the scientific endeavor, the motor that drove it, actually, originally, was faith in God, because it was belief in a rational creator, meant that it was natural as part of worship of God to study that creation. I was just a couple of weeks ago in Prague, and I was talking to them about Johannes Kepler and how he said that God had written the way in which the world works in the language of mathematics, that kind of thing. And that has always been a great inspiration to me. So I'm not slightly the least embarrassed in being a scientist and a Christian, because, as I put it, it was science, it was Christianity that arguably gave me my subject. And one of the deep things about this was, if you think of Kepler, what happened is fascinating. He became the imperial mathematician in the 17th century in Prague. And he was working with the Danish astronomer Tycho Brahe. And Brahe was a brilliant observer. And he was observing the orbit of Mars. And he put Kepler to work and said, you've got to develop some way of understanding this in terms of circular motion, because Aristotle had said centuries before that perfect motion is circular. And so the heavens above the moon are perfect, so they must be circular. So here was Aristotle's worldview being imposed on science. And what Kepler did was step out of that. He said, it doesn't work. I can't fit it. So what I'm going to do is listen to the universe and see what it says. And very rapidly, he came up with the idea that the planets moved in equally perfect ellipses round the sun. And that was a profound move, because what it is really saying that he believed the universe is contingent. That is, God can create it any way he likes. And if you want to find out, you go and look. And that is the genuine scientific attitude. And when these people discovered things about the universe, they didn't say, oh, wonderful, we now know the law of gravity, and you can deduce the planetary motions from the law of gravity. We don't need God. None of them reacted like that. Isaac Newton actually said, what a genius God is to do it that way. In other words, he didn't believe in a kind of God of the gaps. I can't explain it, therefore God did it. It was what he understood of the workings of nature that were evidence of God's working. So that's where I'd start that.
Well, then how did we go from Newton to Hawking? They had kind of different views.
They had kind of different views, yes. It always intrigued me, and it's a big question I asked myself. Isaac Newton, discoverer of the law of gravity, uses it as an argument for God. Stephen Hawking, genius, working on gravitation, uses it as an argument for atheism. And I thought, how do you get from one to the other? And it seems to me that there's a lot underneath this, that I can explain as follows. I think Hawking, he was a brilliant mathematician, and I'm not saying this, one of our greatest contemporary scientists, Lord Rees, the astronomer, said this, that Hawking was a hopeless philosopher. In fact, in his book, The Grand Design, which is fascinating because he, like everybody else, sees that the universe gives an impression of design, and yet he tries to explain it away. And I want to argue that Hawking made this mistake. Why? Because he had a false understanding of science. Now, that's a pretty big thing to say of a world-famous cosmologist. And secondly, he had a false understanding of God. Let me address the first one and two of them, if you don't mind, briefly. Think of science. I like to put it this way. Why is the water boiling? Well, because heat energy is being transmitted through the copper sides of the kettle, and it's agitating the water molecules and it's boiling. That's why it's boiling. Well, yes, it is, but it's also boiling because I want a cup of tea. Now, think of those. Those are two different explanations, aren't they? But think of them. They don't conflict. They don't compete. They complement each other. And in fact, outside the lab, the tea explanation is by far the most important. People have been enjoying tea for millennia before they knew anything about heat transfer. Now, the interesting thing about that is, let's extrapolate that up to the size of the universe. You see, Hawking says explicitly, you've got to choose between science and God. You can't have both. And I wondered about this for years. How could you possibly say that? Well, you can say it if you think that the God explanation is the same as the scientific explanation. Dawkins believes that. So one excludes the other. But you see, working on the basis of that illustration I've said to you, I can put it this way. God no more competes with science as an explanation of the universe than Henry Ford competes with automobile engineering and physics as an explanation for the motor car. They're different kinds of explanation. One is in terms of science, law, laws of nature, and so on. The other is in terms of an agent. It's a totally different kind of explanation. And a lot of heat is taken out of the so-called science-God tension if we realize that. To sum that up, science tends to answer the questions, how does this work? And why a function? Why is that bit there, etc. It doesn't answer the question, why of purpose? That can only be answered in terms of an agency. And to have a complete explanation, you need both. And what I contend for is we need to think seriously about what it means to explain. You see, when I went to school, some of my teachers weren't very good. And I was taught that the law of gravity explained gravity. But it doesn't. Newton realized that, but he put it in Latin. That's why people don't know it. He said, non fingo hypothesi. I don't make hypotheses. I don't pretend to know what gravity is. No one today even knows that. Now, if you don't believe that, read Richard Feynman, one of your finest physicists of the last century. What he did was, he found the law of gravitation, which enables you to do calculations accurate enough to put a man on the moon. But it doesn't tell you what gravity is. So that explanation only tells you part of the story. It's very important to realize that, even within science itself. Now to the second part. Choose between science and God. Well, there are different kinds of gods. And unfortunately, Stephen Hawking, like Dawkins, got mixed up in his gods. And what he's thinking of, and it took me a long time, I'm afraid, I was a bit slow in the uptake to realize that often their concept of a god is the Greek concept. People didn't understand lightning or thunder, so they postulated a god of lightning and thunder. And then you come to Rice University, you take atmospheric physics 101, and those gods disappear very quickly. So science has got rid of lots of gods, and a good thing too. But you see, the God of the Bible is not a God of the gaps. We can't explain it, therefore God did it. I sometimes say to people, have you read the first statement in the Bible carefully? It goes like this: in the beginning, God created the bits of the universe we don't yet understand. Well, it doesn't. It says, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. That is everything. The bits we do understand, the bits we don't. And I've already said that Newton's reaction was the bits that we do understand give evidence of God, of an intelligent creator. Just like if you understand something about art, you will see much more in the genius of a Rembrandt or a Picasso than I can see, who know nothing about art. The more you understand, the more you admire the genius of the person behind it. And suddenly I realized that what Hawking was doing is saying that you've got to choose between science and a Greek god. That's a totally different question. And you see, they have the habit of saying, had a debate in Oxford with a number of people. Dawkins was there, but he didn't debate. And it was put to me rather cynically that I was an atheist. And the explanation was, well, Lennox, you're an atheist with respect to Baal, Zeus, Astarte, and all these gods. And I admit I am totally atheistic with regard to all of those gods. And then Michael Shermer, who was the person there, he gave a big smile and said, we just go one god further, and we add Jehovah to the list. He hasn't a clue about the ancient gods. But there are people that have a clue. Werner Jaeger, world expert in Oxford on the Greek gods, said this. Listen carefully. He said the difference between the Greek, Babylonian, Assyrian gods and the biblical God is this: that those ancient gods were descended from the heavens and the earth. They were products of the chaotic creation. The God of the Bible created the heavens and the earth. There's a massive difference. And science doesn't displace that God. In fact, if God hadn't created the universe and scientists, there'd be nothing there to study, and there'd be no scientists to study it. So it seems to me that we can answer this question. How do you get from Newton to Hawking? You get there by making fundamental mistakes about the nature of science and the nature of God.
Okay, good. Before I ask the next question, I'm going to ask you to take off your glasses because I think they're hitting your microphones, and I don't want to. Perfect. All right. So, what do you think of this statement? Religion depends on faith. Science depends on fact.
Depends which religion. That's the first reaction, which is hopeless, really, as an explanation of anything. But what lies behind this is a total confusion as to what faith means. If you look at some dictionaries and certainly talk to many atheists, I ask them all the time, what is faith in your view? And they say faith is a religious word that means believing where there's no evidence. Both of those statements are false when it comes to Christianity, because faith actually has two meanings in the English language. It has an objective meaning and a subjective meaning. The objective meaning is in phrases like the Christian faith, the Jewish faith. That is, it's a set of things to be believed. But then there's your faith and my faith that can be in anything. You could have faith in the, what do they call them, the Astros?
Yeah, it's hard to have faith in them sometimes.
But you see, you're all laughing, which is great because you understand what I'm saying about this. Faith is not just a religious word. It's an ordinary word. In English, it comes from the Latin fides, and we get another word from fides, fidelity, trustworthiness, all these ideas. So faith in the atheist sense often is what most people would define as blind faith. And that is totally false. Now, let me make a couple of things very clear. First of all, the Christian faith is not blind faith. John, when he's writing his explanation, just after he talks about the evidence for the resurrection that Jim has so brilliantly summarized for us, he describes why he wrote his gospel. And he says, many other signs Jesus did which are not written in this book, but these are written in order that you may believe, have faith, that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, and that believing and that having faith, you might have life in his name. In other words, here's the evidence. And those signs were mostly what we call the miracles of Jesus. The pointers to who he is. They're evidence upon which faith is to be based. You'd be crazy to believe in Jesus if there was no evidence. And we are used to this. You remember the financial crisis? You know why it happened, in the opinion of some. We thought we could trust the bankers. But unfortunately, there was a lot of things going on behind the scenes, and there was a huge crash. And it took a long time before, quotes, trust came back into the market. All of us know, because of that crisis, the difference between evidence-based faith and blind faith. And if you go in to get a mortgage for your house, you try saying to the bank, oh, just believe me, I can pay this back. Just trust me. They won't just trust you. They will ask you for collateral evidence and all the rest of it. We live in a world where trust is hugely important in all areas of life. You exercised faith by coming here tonight. You believed there was going to be a talk and a discussion at 7 o'clock. So actually you believe in absolute truth, but that's another thing. The point is, we are all, now here's the big thing, everybody is a person of faith. The BBC phoned me up, that's our British Broadcasting Association, phoned me up some time ago and they said, Professor Lennox, we'd like to talk to you in an interview about faith schools. And I said, oh, I'd love to do that. I said, shall we start with the biggest group of faith schools? And he said, what's that? Well, I said, secular schools, because they're pumping out atheism. And there was dead silence. Oh, he said, I was going to talk about Christian schools. I said, look, every school's a faith school. There's not a school that isn't promulgating and teaching a worldview. And that was the end of the conversation, and I wasn't interviewed. Because this is a hugely important thing, that if we need to get it into our heads that every person has a worldview that they believe. And you read incredible things written by atheists. Christopher Hitchens, whom I debated a couple of times, is amazing, bless him, the late Christopher Hitchens. He says in one of his books, our beliefs are not a belief, our faith is not a faith. And that is absolute nonsense. And Dawkins wrote, atheists have no faith, and then there follow 400 pages on what he believes. Absolutely incredible. And can I tell them a story?
Yes.
Would you like a story? I debated Peter Singer, and you can watch it. And I told the audience what I told you, that my parents were believers, in a debate. And he came back and he said, well, there you are. That's my biggest objection to religion. People stay in the faith in which they were brought up. And I thought, this is going to be real fun. So when I got the opportunity to speak, I said, Peter, I told people honestly where I'm coming from, but you didn't. Tell me, were your parents atheists? He said, yes, they were. Oh, I said, so you have remained in the faith in which you were brought up. Oh, but he said it isn't a faith. Oh, I said, Peter, I'm sorry, I thought you believed it. And cyberspace went mad at that point. Here is one of the world's most famous philosophers from Princeton, and he doesn't see that his atheism is a belief system. That's a pretty serious thing, you know. And it's hugely important. So in answer to the question, faith on the Christian side is evidence-based. Now come to the scientific side. Faith is essential to science. I was taught quantum physics years ago at Cambridge by the late Professor Sir John Polkinghorne. And in his book, he points out this, quote, physics is powerless to explain its faith in the rational intelligibility of the universe. Why? Because you have to believe that before you do any physics at all. Putting it simply, if you're going to be a scientist, like Jim Tour here, you have to believe that science can be done. You've got to be committed to that. That's your belief. That's your credo. And Einstein,
the uniformity argument.
He once wrote, I cannot imagine a genuine scientist without that faith. He didn't mean faith in God. He meant faith in the mathematical intelligibility of the universe, which means that we can, at least in part, understand what's out there in terms of mathematics. And all scientists believe that. So the idea of saying there's faith over here and that's religious, and there's science over here that doesn't involve faith, is totally false. That's why I will never give talks on science and faith, because that's an atheist formulation. I often say to people, do you want me to talk about God? And they say, sure. I say, it's not in the title. Oh, yes, it is faith. No, I said, I can give you a talk about faith in science and faith in God, but you didn't mention God, so I better not talk about him. Oh, please do. So it's very important to realize that, folks. What Jim was talking about, and it's hugely important, is that there's a solid evidential base historically and in our experience that Jesus rose from the dead, because the implication of what we were told is that he can be met now.
Yep.
And that is one of the biggest evidences to me, the transformation that has occurred in my life and that of my family, and over the years knowing God's guidance. So evidence-based faith is science, and it's also in Christianity. Let me put it another way. One of the big deceptions of the contemporary scene is this, that science and rationality are coextensive. Hence, can science explain everything? No, it can't, because rationality goes well beyond science, and it's a good thing, because if science and rationality were the same thing, half the faculties in this university would have to close. There'd be no languages, history, economics, because those aren't natural sciences. They're rational disciplines. So is philosophy and theology. So the natural sciences are powerful because they're limited. And the greatest scientists can see that very clearly.
Thank you. So tell me, the Bible, can we really take the Bible literally when we have this scientific world? Could it be taken literally? Or is it just a bunch of stories?
Well, neither, actually. I don't know anybody that takes the Bible completely literally. Jesus said, I am the door. What was he made of? Steel, glass, or plastic? Now, I know you laugh at this, but this is a serious business. The word literal is totally inadequate to define the categories that we meet in any literature or language. And we make a huge mistake here. The Bible is the revealed truth of God. I believe it is true, and it is the words of God revealed to us. But the language that's used is not always literal language. Otherwise, it would be monumentally boring. Just think of this. I remember sitting on a plane in Australia, and this Australian said to me, big chap, he said, what have you been doing in my country? I said, I've been teaching the book of Revelation. And he said, man, he said, did you take that literally? And I said, when people like you ask me a question like that, I say to them this: Israel was a land flowing with milk and honey. Now I said, how do you take that? Do you take it literally? When the Israelites came in, they met a great sticky mess of honey and milk coming rushing down the main street of Jerusalem. No, I said, a chap like you would take it spiritually. Israel was a land full of the milk of the Word of God and the honey of the Holy Spirit. And he thought I was completely crazy. And I said, look, let's analyze it, because it's actually quite interesting. Israel was a land. Is that literal? Of course it is. The milk and the honey were literal. There was good grass and cows and produced good milk, and there were bees and flowers and so on. Flowing is a metaphor. So you've got literal bits in that and flowing. But now here's the mistake that people make. They think that because there's a metaphor used, it's not real. Now, C.S. Lewis taught me a great deal. I used to listen to him lecture, but he taught me a great deal through his writings. And one of the things is this: a metaphor always stands for something real. You see, if I said to you, I was watching Jim Tour yesterday, and he was flying down the campus road in his Hyundai car yesterday at Rice. Now, what do you think? Would you say he was 50 feet up in the air or 75? Of course you wouldn't. Jim's real, the campus is real, and he's driving fast. That's a reality. So let me come back to Jesus' claim. I am the door. Jesus is not a literal door, but he's a real door. He's a real doorway into, at this level up, a literal experience of God. That's what you've been describing. The problem is, folks, the word literal is hopeless. It's almost useless. And scholars have now reserved the word literalistic for the base level. But for language to be living, we use metaphor all the time. See, if I say to you, I met Fred the other day and his heart's broken, would you send him to a surgeon? No, because you're describing with a metaphor a very real and literal experience of anxiety and anguish. Do you get the meaning? So the first thing to realize is, what is the nature of any literature at all? And the way we speak to each other is full of metaphor, and that makes it interesting. God does exactly the same thing. In Genesis 1, it says, and God said. Does that mean God's a voice box and lungs like we've got? Of course not. Because God is spirit. So what does it mean? It means he communicates. In what way? We haven't a notion. But we can understand from our understanding of what speech is that this is describing real communication. Does that make sense to you? So my approach to that is to be very aware of how language is used. Now, having said that, I will repeat what I said before. I believe in the full inspiration of Scripture as God's Word. And now, what was your question, Jim? I mean, you talked about
I'm afraid to use the word literally. Can we take the Bible seriously in this scientific world?
Of course we can. Of course we can, at all kinds of different levels. Now, there are many different levels of this, and I was introduced as a young person, as a teenager, to the kind of evidence you'd want to ask for something that's an ancient historical document or claims to be. Is it true to history? And is there evidence of that? Now, let me just take an example of that. The first Christian history was written by Luke. Now, Luke is the most interesting person. He's the only scientifically trained person that writes in the New Testament. Probably studied medicine at Alexandria, which is a brilliant center of it. But he was also a brilliant historian. Now, all the technical language he uses for various city officials, for places and all, have been checked and checked again, and he gets them all right. And scholars will tell you it's one of the most accurate descriptions of the ancient world, much of it checkable. Now, that's the kind of thing that ancient historians can assure us as of the facts. Now, I was amazed to read in Richard Dawkins' book, The God Delusion, where he said a good case can be made that Jesus never existed. Well, he's fair enough to say, actually, I don't go down that route. And he quotes a professor, though, who believes that. But I did a bit of checking. Who was that professor? He was a retired professor of German. Not an ancient historian at all. Then I checked with the ancient historians, and I find that whether they're atheists or not, there is scarcely one in the entire world that doubts not only that Jesus existed, but that much of what the New Testament says about him, including even the resurrection appearances, are true to history and happened. Now, that kind of thing I find is very helpful. The manuscript evidence for the New Testament is huge. I was taught Caesar's Gallic Wars at school, but they never told me, and I may not remember this accurately, that the first actual documents that we have of Caesar's Gallic War were written 900 years or so after the events, and there are very few of them. We have 5,000 manuscripts at least of the New Testament. Some of them go back into the 2nd century. The documentary evidence for the authenticity of the New Testament is the greatest documentary evidence we have for any book from the ancient world. Now that's a good start. Mm-hmm. And so my response to it is that we're talking now not about the natural sciences. We're talking about what I would call forensic science. When you're talking about the past, you can't have science in the narrow sense of repeated experimentation. That's true in science as well. You cannot repeat the history of the universe in the lab to see what happened. You have to make inferences about the past from what you perceive in the present. A lot of science, of the kind that Jim does, is experimental science where he writes a paper and he expects and believes that it can be reproduced by anybody else in another laboratory. That's one kind of science. But there's also, that's inductive science. There's another kind called abductive science, inference to the best explanation. And a forensic scientist uses that all the time. If A happened, we'd expect B to happen. Well, we see B, so it's a reasonable inference that A did happen. You can't prove it conclusively. But that's the same with Scripture. We can get at it. We can get evidence by arguing in that kind of way, and we can approach the resurrection that way, and Jim has demonstrated that in what he said earlier. So it's a rational discipline, and therefore I believe there's very, very strong evidence at that level. But in the end, to me, the strongest evidence is when and this will sound sentimental to some of you, but I don't mean it to be, when I hear the voice of God through his word. That's what ultimately convinced me. When I sensed something speaking to me from through that word and beyond it that had the ring of deep truth. And that's hugely important. And that's what I'd expect. If Scripture is actually God's word, then God's speaking. And he's speaking still. And one would expect to experience that. The trouble is we're so busy, we fill ourselves with noise, we anesthetize ourselves with headphones all the time, and we don't have time to listen to the still small voice or really start as adults reading Scripture and saying, God, speak to me. I think that is in the end the best way of establishing the reality of it.
Yes. Now, before I ask the next question, I have forgotten my time sheet. Zach or somebody tell me, what time do we go to the questions? 8:15. 8:15. Okay, so we're going to take one more question. Here's a tough one. Miracles. What's with the miracles in the Bible?
The word miracle comes from the Latin miraculum, something to be wondered at. And so we say that of people, you know. It's an absolute miracle that Jane passed that last exam because she didn't do any work for it. Now, we're not talking about that kind of thing. You see, in Scripture, they're called signs. The word miracle is Latin, it's not Greek. They're called signs, and what I want to emphasize is The biblical claim is these are supernatural things. And the resurrection is the prime one of them. It's evidence that this world is not the only world there is. Now, here you come up against Scotland in all its brilliant Enlightenment 17th century force with David Hume, who said, and it's influenced millions of scientists ever since, miracles are violations of the laws of nature, and therefore essentially they cannot happen and are not believable by anyone who has any pretensions to be a scientist. Now, David Hume was wrong. And I got to know late in his life the chief interpreter of David Hume, Professor Anthony Flew. And late in life, he came to realize that Hume was wrong too. And he came to realize and believe that there was some kind of God, that was really deism behind the universe. And I interviewed him and I said, what about human miracles? And I've never heard such a humble statement from a brilliant philosopher. He said, you know, he said, I was wrong about Hume. And all my books would have to be rewritten, but I'll never live to do that. Now, what's the problem with Hume? Miracles are violations of the laws of nature. I suspect on this campus, there are little notices that used to put fear in me as I drove around the United States. Violators will be towed. Do you know that notice?
Oh, yeah, I know that notice.
Yes.
I've experienced
Violators
firsthand.
will be told. That's a violation of civil law. Now, here's the problem. The big confusion is that the laws of nature are the same as the laws of the state. Now, and violation is exactly that kind of term. You get put in jail for violating a state law. C.S. Lewis put it brilliantly. So let me tell you his analogy. I'm staying here in Houston. Now just imagine I'm in a hotel. And on the first evening, I put $100 in my bedside drawer. And on the second evening, I put another $100 in my bedside drawer. The third day I'm leaving the hotel, I open the drawer and there are $10 in it. Now, what do I conclude? That the laws of arithmetic have been broken or the laws of the state of Texas? You know which, the laws of Texas, yes? How do I know that? Because the laws of arithmetic have not been broken. You see, 100 plus 100 is 200. And it was true yesterday, the day before, and today. And because I know that a thief has put his or her hand in and taken $190 out. Do you understand that? It's very simple. I find some professors may just understand it. It's too late at night for jokes, isn't it? This is hugely important, the confusion about this. You see, the interesting thing is, in order to recognize that a thief has put their hand in, you have to know about the laws of arithmetic that they don't get broken. Now, hold that in your mind for a moment. God has made the universe, and what we call the laws of nature are our descriptions of what normally happens. If I drop an apple, it will fall according to Newton towards the center of the earth. That doesn't stop you catching it and not hitting even the floor. In other words, they describe what will happen unless the parameters, the setting is changed. And the laws of nature can't prevent that. So that's hugely important. Now, Hume had a second point, and he said it was very easy to believe in miracles in the days, the primitive days of the New Testament, because they didn't know the laws of nature. That is totally false. Joseph was engaged to Mary. Do you remember what happened? And she came to him and said, I'm pregnant. Did he know where babies normally come from? He certainly did. And we are told that he wanted to divorce her privately because he was a good man. He knew exactly where they came from. And so he didn't believe her story until God intervened and gave him such a supernatural shock that he realized that this was something of God and he had to accept it. And wonderfully, he did. Think of the blind man in John chapter 9. If you look it up afterwards, here's a man, Jesus cures him, he's blind, and there's all sorts of argy-bargy with the theologians. This wasn't the man, he wasn't blind, and all this kind of thing. And the man said, look, since the beginning of the world, he said to these theologians, it has never been heard that a man born blind gets his sight back. So he recognized this wasn't a violation. Because you see, let me put it this way, back to the resurrection. The resurrection of Jesus was not caused by natural processes going on in the grave 5 minutes before the resurrection. God raised him from the dead. That's an entirely different thing. You see, God creates a universe and he builds into it certain laws, which we recognize, and that helps us to recognize when God does something special. He doesn't break any laws. He feeds something new in from outside, and then the laws of nature take over, so that when Mary conceived by the power of God's Spirit, 9 months later, as Dr. Luke tells us, a child was born. So he is actually using a law of nature there to demonstrate to us the authenticity of this story. Finally, Luke is very interesting. I said he was a medic. His gospel shows us exactly that they understood this prime objection. Luke starts with a story, not about Jesus, but of Zacharias, a priest. He believed in God. He was praying in the temple. He obviously believed in angels that were supernatural because he talked to one. But this particular angel that appeared while he was praying said, your prayers are heard. You're going to have a child. Now, he just didn't believe it because he was very old and so was his wife. And he said, we are old. And he pointed out the law of nature that he and everybody else knows, that you get too old, mercifully, that you can't have children anymore. He knew that. That was the law of nature. So he was being challenged to believe that God could do something. He didn't believe it. And the angel said, you're going to be dumb until it happens.
I'm going to have to make a break. I'll be back to continue this.
Believe that God can turn the physical clock back. You've got nothing to say. There's no transcendent dimension in your message. And he was silent until he admitted that God was going to do something. So Luke understood perfectly. The very first part of his gospel is devoted to telling us that the people in the first century understood this objection as much as the 20th century physicists. And that's one of the reasons why science has nothing to say against the idea of a God who creates a universe, builds regularities into it that we can understand. You see, you have to know the laws in order to recognize a miracle. If I didn't know that the normal thing was for dead bodies to remain dead, I wouldn't be the least bit surprised by resurrection. Would you? No. So it's a complete misunderstanding. And therefore, we can, I believe, with moral, intellectual integrity, as scientists, announce to the world that the resurrection of Jesus Christ is a fact both of history that has huge implications in our experience.
Well, I guess that means that the answer is no. Can science explain everything? And it's no. All right, with that, we're going to shift and we're going to take questions from the audience. So, Zach, you're going to lead us through this, right?
Yes. Well, what a wonderful conversation that we've been able to witness tonight. And what an incredible blessing to have Doctors Lennox and Tour here to just share their heart and their faith with all of us. My name is Zach McCrae. I am an alumnus from Rice University, but more excitedly, I am the chapter director and campus minister for Ratio Christi here at Rice. It is an apologetics ministry geared towards equipping believers to have answers for why we believe what we believe, and we love to host conversations like this. As our mic handlers go to the middle level, you'll notice that they are two very handsome and very faithful men. We have Andy Dennis, who is the chapter director, the campus minister for Baptist Student Ministries. We are so thankful for his work in organizing this, mobilizing students. And also Joshua Montgomery, who is our campus minister for Crew. And we are so grateful for your hard work in all of this. And thank you to City Rise, to West University Baptist for helping put this on as well. And so with that, if you would form a line in front, all the way towards the back, our mic handlers will be on this middle level. Do not go past them. They will have the mic. They will hold onto the mic. And that is how you will ask your questions. So, Dr. Lennox, would you mind explaining how you want the questions to be asked?
Well, I know that in an audience like this, we all want to hear everybody else's question. So what I'm going to do is listen to 4 or 5 questions before we answer any of them. That'll give you all an idea of what's buzzing around in your minds. So state your question briefly. I'll write it down. You can go and sit down, and the next person, and we'll alternate perhaps from side to side. And I'll collect some questions, and then we'll look at them. So number 1.
And I wrote it down also, but several years ago, Drs. William Dembski and Robert Marks II from Baylor University developed 3 conservation of information theorems, also known as the no free lunch theorems. These show that basically complex information like what we find in DNA and other complex molecular machines could not have been created by natural processes. Do we go too far if we affirm that these 3 theorems are the closest that we get to proving scientifically the existence of God?
Thank you. Number 2.
Dr. Lennox, so you mentioned some of the readings from Genesis 1. Certainly on a surface reading, you could see that God has blessed us not only with telling us that he created the world, but also giving us a bit of insight into how. But in addition, you've also talked about the difference between the inductive method and abductive sort of sciences recently. How would you kind of characterize the gap that seems to be there between the way most people view cosmological history versus the way that Genesis 1 describes how God created the universe?
Okay, thank you very much. 3.
This is a question primarily for Dr. Tour, although Dr. Lennox, I'd love to hear your perspective on this. Why are so many scientists so quick to propose a sort of naturalism of the gaps as opposed to just saying, we don't know, and as Plato citing Socrates, we're going to follow the evidence where it leads?
Thank you. Okay, 4.
A question I get a lot by my fellow students in my science classes is how we can explain as Christians the geologic and Earth time scale. And I would just like to know how you would explain that, and if it's all the science is wrong on how we date the Earth, or if our understanding of it is not up to par.
Thank you very much. 5.
I was curious, so we talked a lot about
different... It's a
different...
very good thing to be curious. You know.
Well, I'm very glad. We talked so much about different types of evidence, and I'm curious specifically on the evidence after the resurrection appearances of all the power that the early church experienced from God and all the various miraculous outpourings that we're no longer simply authenticating Jesus' own words in his lived ministry, but the church's own experience of what God was doing after he had ascended.
And what's the question?
The question is, why do we in the West not regularly see the same type of events, in your opinion? And is that something that can be rectified and used as evidence for
Thank
Christianity?
you. How many are left up there? 6?
It's like the same question as 4, I think. Like, what is your opinion of the 6,000 year versus like the fossils of all the things that we examine? Like the year of the Earth, how do we?
Oh, okay,
Yeah.
fine, got it. You know, this is a great method. I just keep writing until the time's up and then I go home. Is there another person still standing? One more question then. Okay, 7 is a lovely number. We'll take one more and then we'll have a look, and we'll have another go later if we've time. Your question, sir.
I've heard you say in debates that if you arrive at a belief in a moral law, you can posit a moral lawgiver. And to me, that's intuitive, but to some agnostics and atheists, it is not. And I was wondering if you were able to articulate a logical connection from moral law to moral lawgiver that might convince somebody that it's not so intuitive to.
Okay, thank you very much. Now, Jim, you heard these. Which of them are you going to take first? Is there any one of those you'd like to?
Well, there was only one directed to me, so I.
Okay, you take that one.
Read it to me again.
Which one was it?
It was the one directed to me. I think it was Paul's question. What was it, Paul? Oh, yeah.
The naturalism of the gaps.
Why don't scientists just come out and say, I don't know? I don't know. I don't know why they don't just come out and say that. Because clearly we don't know many things when it comes to the origin of life, when it comes to the origin of information, when it comes to the origin of how chemical bonds would come together, the origin of the assembly of a cell. We just don't know. I think it takes a philosopher to maybe begin to get at why scientists are so prone to not say, I don't know. The question of the origin of life is so fundamental to who we are. How did we get here? I mean, this is a real fundamental question. It sort of predates anything else. And we can't even answer that one. So maybe that's why they feel that compelled to do that. But it's hard for me to get into their brain why they're doing that. And that's my frustration with it all the time. And that's why I keep poking them and pushing them, and they keep avoiding me. I'm done.
Okay, well, you notice, and this is why it's helpful to collect questions. There are 3 questions out of the 7 on the same topic. Did you notice that? And they're all about the age of the Earth. Do you want to know how old the Earth is? It's quite a bit older than me. So let's have a look at this, because it bothers many people. And I want to say unnecessarily so. I gave a speech at my old school 2 weeks ago. And my old school, I must confess this at the beginning, you see, and you'll see why in a moment. My old school was founded by an archbishop and a mathematician. The archbishop's name was Ussher. And he calculated the age of the Earth. Well, he wrote to the Vice Chancellor of Cambridge University a letter, famous letter. And he said, "Dear sir, I have worked out that Adam was born at 9 o'clock on the 5th of October, 4004 BC. I am sorry that I cannot give any more precise information than that." And that has gone down in history as Archbishop Ussher's Young Earth chronology. Now, I was standing beside his successor, who is the chairman of the governors of my school. And I turned to him and I said, "Sir, Ussher was a historian, and so are you." Now, Ussher's interesting because many people laugh at his calculation. What they don't know is that both Newton and Kepler made an almost similar calculation in that time. We never hear of that. But I said to the Archbishop, Your Grace, he was sitting here, I said, I suspect you probably reckon the Earth and the universe are about 7 orders of magnitude older than that. But I said, whatever the answer to the question is, we must not forget that he got one thing absolutely right, and that is there was a creation. Now, the most important thing about this is not when it happened, not even how it happened, but that it happened. And you know, it took centuries before people came to it. I was at Cambridge in the 1960s, not the 1860s, the 1960s, when the first evidence, really strong evidence from the microwave background came in that the universe was of finite age. Do you know, many people today don't know, that the scientific establishment resisted that fiercely. The chief editor of Nature, the world's most famous scientific magazine at the time, a man called Maddox, said we shouldn't go down this line that there was a creation at a finite time in the past. Quote, it gives too much leverage to people that believe the Bible. That is one of the most significant scientific discoveries of the 20th century, was resisted because it paralleled what Scripture said. Now come to the 21st century, and I was in a very prestigious gathering of physicists, philosophers, and so on. And I was the token Christian. And I was asked to say something about this. And I got up and said something about creation, and I was heckled. A leading scientist stopped me dead, and he said, Professor Lennox, stop. You are joking. I hope you're joking if you suggest the Bible has anything to say to us in the 21st century. Wow. I said I wasn't joking. In fact, I said, it's interesting. Of course, the Bible isn't a textbook of science. I don't teach algebra from Leviticus, and I never will. But it does talk in certain places about exactly the same physical universe that scientists study. In the beginning, God created the very heavens and earth that you study. And not only that, it's got the idea, which is very new in terms of science, that creation is finite backwards in time. There's huge mathematical work been done on this that is very convincing. Now I said, I'm going to make a suggestion. If you, scientists, had not been so wedded to Aristotle and his eternal universe, you might just have looked more carefully to see if there was evidence of a finite age to the universe long before you did.